Hi guys and welcome to History for Calm Nights. Tonight we step quietly into the coldest corners of 1800s America, where winter does not politely tap at the door but presses its frozen face against the window and waits. You stand outside a small wooden cabin as dusk fades, snow crunching beneath your boots, the sky already bruised with deep indigo. Smoke lifts thinly from a chimney that looks far too small for the work it must do. The air bites at your nose. Your eyelashes feel slightly stiff. You draw one long breath and immediately regret it. It is the kind of cold that makes you question your life choices. You probably would not survive this without a plan. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you are listening from and what your local time is right now. I love imagining this circle of quiet night howls around the world. Now dim the lights. You push open the rough wooden door and step into a space no larger than a modern bedroom. The smell hits first. Wood smoke, damp wool, faint animal hide, and something earthy lingering in the floorboards. The hearth glows at the far wall, not roaring, but steady as if conserving strength. You close the door quickly behind you because every second it remains open is an invitation for the outside to rush in. Winter in 19th century America was not an inconvenience. It was a season that tested architecture patience and lungs. Across much of the country, from New England to the upper Midwest, temperatures regularly plunged far below freezing for weeks at a time. Diaries from the era describe ink freezing in wells and water buckets turning solid overnight. One widely accepted historical detail is that during the winter of 1835 in the northeast harbours froze so thickly that people walked across sections that normally held ships. Imagine going to bed knowing even the ocean has given up its motion. You remove your outer coat heavy with snow and hang it near the fire. It will not truly dry tonight. Nothing ever fully dries in this season. The cabin walls are made of rough logs chinked with mud and bits of fibre to keep out drafts. You run your fingers along one seam and feel a faint whisper of air. The cold is patient. It always finds a way in. There is no thermostat here, no reassuring digital glow. Heat is labour. Heat is wood you chopped in autumn. Stacked in careful cords prayed would be enough. You glance at the pile near the hearth and make a quick mental calculation. Will it last until March? Perhaps, perhaps not. In many rural homes of the time, families slept in the same room where they cooked and worked because it was the only space that could reasonably be heated. Bedrooms, if they existed upstairs, were often so frigid in winter that water pitchers froze solid beside the bed. Some households simply abandoned those upper rooms until spring. You can almost feel that choice pressing on you now. Stay near the fire or gamble on privacy and frost. Privacy usually loses. A small window rattles faintly in the wind. Outside the prairie or forest or frozen field stretches wide and indifferent. Inside the glow of the hearth throws long shadows that flicker like quiet ghosts along the walls. You move closer to it instinctively. People of this era did not sleep because they were comfortable. They slept because exhaustion claimed them. Days were filled with hauling butchers, tending animals, mending clothing, chopping wood, and preparing food that would not spoil in the cold. By the time night fell, your body ached enough that even a hard surface felt like mercy. There is a lesser-known tidbit that sometimes surprises modern readers. In especially cold regions, some families kept a chamber pot beneath the bed, not only for convenience, but because stepping onto a frozen floor in the dark could be genuinely dangerous. Frostbite was not dramatic and cinematic. It was quiet and creeping, beginning with numb toes and ending in damage that lasted a lifetime. You kneel beside the hearth and adjust a log with an iron poker. Sparks leap briefly, then settle. The sound is soft, almost conversational. Fire was not merely warmth, it was reassurance. A common belief of the period held that a well-banked fire could protect a household from illness, as if the flame itself pushed sickness back. While medical understanding was limited, there was practical truth here. Warmth reduced exposure, and exposure often meant respiratory trouble. Still, historians continue to debate whether people of the early 19th century slept in shorter segmented cycles during winter, waking in the middle of the night for prayer, quiet chores or reflection before returning to bed. Some letters suggest this pattern was common, especially in rural areas without artificial light. As you stand here in the flicker, you can imagine it. Sleep not as one long unbroken surrender, but as two softer descents separated by a watchful pause. The floor beneath your boots is cold enough to sting through the leather. You stamp your feet lightly and sit on a simple wooden chair near the hearth. The wind presses again at the walls, a low, steady hum. It is not angry tonight, only persistent. You think about how the land itself shapes the way you rest. In places like the Great Plains where winter winds could travel unbroken for miles, cabins were sometimes built partially into hillsides to gain shelter. In forested regions, thick timber provided a natural barrier. Geography dictated bedtime strategy. And then there is the simple truth that blankets were not decorative. They were survival tools. Thick wool, sometimes layered with quilts stitched from scraps of old clothing, trapped heat in small pockets. Feather beds, when families could afford them, were prized not for luxury, but for insulation. You glance toward the bed in the corner. Now its shape barely visible in the low light. It waits like a small island of promise. Before you lie down, though, you must ensure the fire will endure. You gather ash carefully and bank it over the glowing coals, reducing airflow so the embers will smoulder rather than flare. This technique was passed down quietly from parent to child, neighbour to neighbour. It was a domestic science built on experience rather than textbooks. If done correctly, the fire will still hold a red heart by morning, ready to be coaxed back into flame. If done poorly, you wake to a dead hearth in a room that feels like the inside of a snowbank. You straighten slowly and stretch your back. Outside, the night deepens. Inside, the cabin settles into its own rhythm. Wood creaks softly as temperatures drop. The roof gives a faint crack as frost tightens its grip. You move toward the bed, already aware that warmth will not greet you instantly. You will carry your heat with you, build it layer by layer. Winter here is not conquered. It is negotiated with patience and quiet determination. And as you prepare to lie down for the first time in this long season of cold, you realize that sleep in 1800, America is not simply rest. It is an act of trust. Trust in your walls, trust in your fire, trust in tomorrow's sunrise. You do not drift off immediately. The bed in the corner is not yet warm, and the warmth here is something you must create with intention. You sit on its edge and press your palm into the mattress. It is firm, uneven, faintly lumpy. The ticking fabric that holds the stuffing inside feels cool against your skin. This is not the cloud-like softness of modern sleep. This is a structure made for endurance. In the early 19th century, many frontier beds were rope beds, their frames laced with thick cords stretched tightly across the bottom. Over time, the ropes loosened, sagging under weight, and required regular tightening with a small tool. That phrase, sleep tight, may well have come from this practice. It is one of those familiar sayings that once carried a literal instruction. You picture someone kneeling by candlelight, tugging at rope in winter darkness, so that the mattress would not dip too deeply into the cold air pooling below. You lift the corner of the mattress slightly. Inside is straw, perhaps corn husks, sometimes dried grasses. In wealthier homes there might be feathers. On the frontier, practicality rules. Straw mattresses were replaced or restuffed seasonally because they flattened quickly and could harbour pests. In winter, fresh, dry stuffing also meant better insulation. It is not glamorous, but it works. You stand and walk back to the hearth. The fire glows lower now, obediently banked beneath ash. You hold your hands toward it, letting heat sink into your fingers. Building warmth from bare earth was not simply about the fire. It began months earlier when the house itself was placed. Settlers chose south-facing slopes when possible, allowing winter sun to warm walls during the short day. Windows were kept small to reduce heat loss. Stone chimneys were built thick, storing residual warmth long after flames died down. These were not aesthetic decisions. They were calculations against frost. In many regions, especially in New England and parts of the Midwest, houses were deliberately compact. Large open rooms were beautiful in summer, but impossible to heat efficiently in January. A smaller footprint meant the same fire could maintain livable temperatures. One well-documented architectural feature of the time was the central chimney design, where a massive chimney core stood at the heart of the home with fireplaces opening into multiple rooms. The masonry absorbed heat and released it slowly through the night. You imagine leaning your back against warm brick long after the flames have softened to embers. There is also a lesser-known practice that feels almost ingenious. Some families hung heavy bed curtains around their sleeping space, even in modest cabins. These curtains trapped body heat within a smaller pocket of air. In grander homes of earlier centuries, this was a symbol of status. On the frontier, it was survival engineering. You consider how a simple piece of fabric hung carefully could mean the difference between restless shivering and a few hours of steady rest. You sit again on the edge of the bed and begin layering your blankets. Wool first. Thick and slightly scratchy, but remarkably effective. Wool retains heat even when damp, a quality that made it invaluable in snowy climates. Linen sheets may lie beneath cool at first touch, soon warmed by skin. Quilts stitched from worn clothing carry the faint scent of previous seasons. Each layer is deliberate, each one a barrier between you and the creeping cold. Scholars still dispute how much early American settlers borrowed indigenous building techniques for winter survival. In certain regions, particularly in the upper Midwest and parts of the West, evidence suggests that earth-sheltered construction and strategic placement were influenced by native knowledge. In other areas, traditions came directly from European homelands accustomed to long winters. The blending of these methods created uniquely American solutions shaped by landscape and necessity. As you settle beneath your blankets, you are resting inside a quiet fusion of cultural memory. You slip off your outer garments and pull on a long linen nightshirt. It falls nearly to your ankles. Over it you keep wool stockings. Modesty is less important than warmth in this moment. Some people slept wearing knit caps to prevent heat from escaping through their heads. You hesitate, then pull one down over your ears. It looks faintly ridiculous, but you suspect you will not be laughing at 3 a.m. The wind outside grows louder for a moment, scraping snow along the wall with a dry, whispering sound. You pause and listen. In the 19th century, storms could isolate households for days or even weeks. Roads disappeared under drifts. Communication stopped. In especially harsh winters, livestock perished in open fields and entire communities faced shortages. One widely acknowledged historical reality is that the winter of 1880 to 1881 in the Great Plains was so severe that sudden blizzards caught travellers unaware, leading to tragic losses. That knowledge hums quietly in the back of your mind as you tuck the blanket more tightly beneath your chin. You lie back slowly. The mattress exhales a faint, dusty scent. The ceiling above you is dark timber beams, rough and honest. There is no plaster to soften their appearance. You feel the chill at your shoulders first, then along your feet. For a few minutes the bed seems to resist you, then gradually, subtly warmth gathers. Your breath forms a pale cloud in the dim light. Indoor temperatures in many rural homes during deep winter often hovered just above freezing at night once the fire was banked. By modern standards, that seems unthinkable, yet people adapted. Bodies curled inward, blankets overlapped, shared sleeping arrangements amplified heat. There is an odd comfort in knowing that this discomfort was ordinary. Millions experienced it. They did not frame it as extreme, it was simply winter. A small cracking sound comes from the hearth as a log shifts. You turn your head slightly to watch the faint red glow. Firelight flickers against the wall, a soft pulse in the dark. That glow is your silent partner tonight. Without it, the room would descend into a sharper cold one that gnaws at fingertips and ears. You draw your knees slightly upward, conserving warmth. Beneath layers of wool and quilt, your body begins its slow work. Heat spreads outward from your core. The mattress warms by degrees. The chill at your toes fades first, then at your shoulders. There is one more quiet detail often overlooked in romantic visions of frontier life. Many homes kept dogs inside during the coldest months, not only for companionship but for added warmth and security. A dog curled near the foot of the bed could serve as both alarm system and living heater. You half expect to feel a heavy shape settle against your feet. Outside, the wind continues its patient song. Inside, the cabin holds steady. The architecture, the fire, the fabric, your own breathing all collaborate in this nightly ritual of endurance. You close your eyes, aware that sleep here is not instant comfort, but gradual surrender. The house, built from bare earth and timber, now cradles you as best it can. And as warmth slowly gathers beneath layers of wool and straw, you sense that the true structure protecting you tonight is not just wood and stone, but careful preparation shaped by generations who understood exactly what winter demanded. You hover in that soft space between wakefulness and sleep, aware of the quiet crackle from the hearth and the distant sigh of wind against the walls. Your body is finely warm beneath the blankets, but your mind remains gently alert. In this world, fire is never something you entirely forget. It is companion servant and risk all at once. You open your eyes briefly and turn your head toward the faint red glow across the room. The embers pulse like a slow heartbeat. You banked the fire carefully earlier, drawing ash over the coals to limit oxygen and stretch their life through the night. This was a skill learned young in many households. Children were often taught how to judge the colour of coals, how to listen for the subtle shift in sound when wood settled just right. It was not dramatic knowledge, just steady domestic practice. A commonly accepted historical reality is that before the widespread adoption of cast-iron stoves in the mid to late 19th century, open hearths were the primary source of heat in most American homes. These fireplaces were inefficient by modern standards. Much of the warmth escaped straight up the chimney, yet families developed small techniques to improve performance. Reflectors placed behind the fire could push heat outward. Iron cranes allowed pots to swing over flames without smothering them. Every improvement mattered. You shift slightly under the covers and feel a small pocket of cooler air slip in near your shoulder. Instinctively, you tuck the blanket closer. That simple motion repeated countless times each winter night is part of the ritual of surviving cold. Sleep here is not entirely passive. It requires tiny adjustments, half-conscious movements to preserve warmth. In some regions, people used a bed warmer before climbing under blankets. This was a long-handled metal pan filled with hot embers slid carefully between sheets to chase away the initial chill. You can almost imagine the gentle swish of heated metal moving across linen, the faint scent of smoke trailing behind it. There is something faintly ceremonial about warming a bed in advance, like preparing a stage before the main act. Of course, one had to be careful. A stray spark could smoulder unnoticed in fabric. Fire comfort always carried a quiet warning. Researchers still debate how much nighttime vigilance families maintained regarding their hearths. Some accounts suggest that in particularly cold spells, someone might rise once during the night to check the embers and add a small piece of wood. Other sources imply that many simply trusted the banking technique and hoped for the best. It likely varied by region, by temperament, by how much fuel remained stacked outside. As you lie there listening, you feel that tug of responsibility. Do you get up and check once more, or let sleep claim you fully? You decide to rise just briefly. The blankets resist, releasing a small sigh of warmth as you slip out. The floor is colder than before, the chill creeping through your stockings. You cross the room in a few careful steps and kneel by the hearth. The ash shifts under the poker. Beneath it, a deep orange glow still lives. You feel a small wave of relief. You add a sliver of kindling, not enough to flare, just enough to feed the embers. The wood catches, slowly producing a low, steady crackle. Sparks drift upward and vanish in the chimney throat. The smell of fresh wood smoke fills the air, comforting and sharp at once. You watch for a moment, ensuring the flame settles rather than leaps. Firewood itself was a winter currency. Families spent much of autumn cutting, splitting, stacking. In heavily forested areas, wood was abundant but labour-intensive to prepare. On the open plains, timber could be scarce leading settlers. To burn twisted roots, dried dung, or even imported coal if accessible by rail later in the century. The amount of fuel a household secured before snowfall often determined how comfortable their nights would be. Running low in February was not simply inconvenient, it was dangerous. There is an unusual anecdote from certain frontier communities where neighbours informally compared wood piles as a measure of readiness. A towering, neatly stacked pile was a sign of diligence and foresight. A small, uneven stack raised quiet concern. Winter exposed preparation or the lack of it. You picture yourself glancing out the window earlier that day, assessing your own supply with that same private calculation. You rise from the hearth and return to bed quickly, eager to reclaim the pocket of warmth you left behind. Slipping under the blankets again feels like submerging into a small insulated cave. Your feet search for the warmest spot. You curl slightly inward, instinctively conserving heat. Outside, the wind grows softer as if tired of pressing. Snow continues to fall in fine dry grains, brushing against the cabin walls with a sound like distant sand. Inside, the newly fed embers glow brighter for a few minutes before settling back into steady endurance. You think about how fire changed across the century. By the 1850s and 1860s, cast iron stoves began to appear more frequently, especially in towns and cities. These stoves were more efficient and could heat rooms more evenly. They also reduced the constant draft of open hearths. Yet even then, many rural families clung to traditional fireplaces for cooking and familiarity. Change came unevenly shaped by cost and access. The warmth now feels more steep. You sense the room holding its temperature just a little better. Perhaps that small addition of wood made the difference. Perhaps it is simply your body fully adjusting. There is a quiet psychological comfort in tending a fire before sleep. It gives the illusion of control over something vast and indifferent. Winter outside may stretch for months, but inside this cabin you have coaxed flame from ash. That matters. Your eyelids grow heavier. The crackle becomes rhythmic, almost hypnotic. You listen to it as one might listen to gentle rain on a distant roof. Each pop and shift is a reminder that energy still lives in the hearth. As you drift closer to sleep, you recognize that this nightly dance with embers is woven into the fabric of 19th century life. It is not dramatic heroism, it is quiet stewardship. The fire does not roar triumphantly, it glows faithfully. And in that glow you finally allow yourself to surrender, trusting that the red heart in the hearth will still be beating when dawn touches at the frosted window. Sleep does not take you all at once. It arrives in slow waves, receding and returning like a tide against the edge of your thoughts. You shift beneath the blankets, becoming aware of the bed itself in a way you did not earlier. The mattress presses unevenly beneath your shoulder. A small ridge of straw gathers near your hip. You smooth it with your hand, redistributing the filling through the ticking as best you can. Even rest requires maintenance here. The rope bed beneath you creaks faintly as you move. Its wooden frame is sturdy but unadorned, made by hand or by a local craftsman who valued function above ornament. Throughout much of 19th century America, especially in rural areas, furniture was either handmade at home or produced by small regional workshops. Mass-manufactured bedroom sets were still decades away for most families. You are lying on something shaped by local timber and familiar hands, not by distant factories. You draw the quilt up to your chin and notice its patchwork design in the low light. Faded squares of indigo, dull red, soft brown. Each piece once part of a dress, a shirt, a curtain. Quilting was not merely decorative artistry, it was resourcefulness stitched into fabric. In many communities, women gathered in quilting bees during autumn, preparing layers thick enough to withstand the coming freeze. The stitching trapped air between fabrics, creating insulation more effective than a single heavy cloth. There is a small but fascinating detail often overlooked. In some colder regions, families stuffed their bed ticks with dried leaves from certain trees believed to repel insects. The faint scent of those leaves lingered through winter, subtle but distinct. You imagine breathing in a whisper forest each time you turn your head against the pillow. It is practical and strangely poetic at once. As your body settles deeper into the mattress, you consider how sleeping arrangements reflected household structure. It was entirely normal for multiple children to share a bed. Siblings lay side by side, their warmth mingling beneath shared blankets. In particularly cold spells, even adults might consolidate into fewer sleeping spaces. Personal space was a luxury, heat was the priority. Home? Some researchers propose that communal sleeping strengthened familial bonds during harsh winters, though others caution against romanticizing what was simply necessity. You can feel both truths at once. There is comfort in shared warmth, but also the reality that privacy shrinks when temperatures fall. You roll slightly onto your side. The linen sheet against your cheek feels smoother now, warmed by steady contact. Linen was widely used for sheets during this period because it was durable and breathable, though it did little to insulate on its own. That task fell to wool blankets and quilts layered above. In households with more means, featherbeds were prized possessions. Feathers trapped air efficiently, creating a soft and insulating mattress. Yet even featherbeds required regular fluffing to maintain loft, especially after months of winter compression. There is an anecdote from certain Appalachian communities describing the ritual of airing bedding on rare sunny winter days. Families carried mattresses and quilts outside, laying them across fences or shrubs to freshen in crisp air. It sounds counterintuitive, exposing bedding to cold, but sunlight and dry air helped prevent dampness and mildew. You imagine the sight of bright quilts against a field of snow like islands of colour in a white sea. The fire across the room shifts again, softer now. The room holds a fragile balance between warmth and chill. You sense that if the embers were to fade entirely, the temperature would drop swiftly. Yet for now, you are cocooned. Another established historical reality is that bed curtains were not exclusive to grand estates. Even modest households sometimes rigged simple cloth panels around beds to create a smaller heated pocket. In drafty cabins, this could make a noticeable difference. Curtains trapped not only warmth but breath, creating a faintly humid microclimate within. You imagine pulling such curtains close, shutting out the larger dark room, retreating into your own insulated chamber. You stretch your feet slightly and encounter the cool edge of the mattress. Instinctively, you draw them back toward the center. Your body has become acutely aware of thermal boundaries. The edges of the bed are colder. The middle holds the heat you have built. There is a curious folk belief recorded in several 19th century diaries suggesting that placing a small piece of iron at the foot of the bed could ward off certain illnesses or bad dreams. The logic was not scientific, yet it reveals how sleep cold and vulnerability intertwined in the imagination. When nights were long and winds relentless, superstition filled the gaps left by limited medical understanding. Modern scholars continue to examine how perceptions of comfort have shifted over time. What we now consider intolerably cold was once accepted as ordinary. Indoor temperatures that might prompt complaints today were simply winter reality then. Adaptation shaped expectation. Your muscles relax further as you accept that this level of chill at the tip of your nose is not a threat, merely a companion. The quilt rises and falls with your breathing. Beneath it, warmth accumulates gradually. You sense the straw mattress softening slightly under your weight. Even its faint unevenness now feels grounding rather than intrusive. Outside, the storm seems to ease. The wind's tone lowers, less insistent. Snow continues to settle against the cabin walls, forming a natural barrier. In time, drifts may press high along the logs, adding a layer of insulation. What threatens also protects. Winter carries its own contradictions. Your eyelids grow heavier again, thoughts slow, stretching between moments like the ropes beneath your bed. You become aware of the subtle scent of smoke wool and something faintly sweet from dried grasses within the mattress. These are the aromas of 19th century winter nights. Not sterile, not perfumed, but alive. You realize that sleep here is built layer by layer, just like your bedding. Timber walls block the wind. Mud chinking seals cracks. Fire banks beneath ash. Straw cushions your bones. Wool captures your heat. None of it alone would suffice. Together they create the narrow margin in which rest becomes possible. As you drift toward deeper sleep, the bed no longer feels like a simple piece of furniture. It is an engineered refuge assembled from rope, straw, cloth, and inherited knowledge. Each thread and knot carries quiet intention. The hearth's glow dims, further settling into a steady embered calm. The cabin holds its breath with you, and at last, wrapped in quilted memory and patient warmth, you sink a little deeper into the long winter night. You wake briefly, though you are not entirely sure why. Perhaps a subtle shift in temperature, perhaps a dream dissolving too quickly. The room is darker now, the embers in the hearth reduced to a faint red constellation. The cold has edged a little closer. You feel it first at your nose, then at the curve of your shoulder, where the blanket has slipped. Without fully sitting up, you tug the layers higher and tuck them beneath your chin. Layering is not a single act completed before bed. It is an ongoing negotiation through the night. You become aware of what rests against your skin, linen closest to your body, over it wool, over that quilted cotton and scraps stitched into something heavier than it appears. Each textile plays a role in trapping the warmth your body works to produce. Clothing at night was chosen with equal care. A long nightshirt allowed freedom of movement while covering most of the body. In colder regions, woolen undergarments remained on even while sleeping. There was no shame in practicality. Preserving warmth mattered more than aesthetics. In fact, many households kept a designated set of heavier winter sleep garments that were worn only during the coldest months. It's well documented that wool was one of the most valued fibers in 19th century America for winter survival. Sheep thrived in many climates, and wool retained insulating properties even when slightly damp. Cotton, while comfortable, did not offer the same protection once moisture entered the equation. Linen sheets might feel crisp and cool initially, but they were durable and easy to wash. The true defense against freezing nights came from wool blankets layered generously above. You shift your legs and to notice the knit stockings hugging your calves. Removing them would invite cold too quickly. Heat escapes from extremities first. This was understood even without modern thermometers. Families often paid special attention to keeping feet and heads covered at night. Some wore simple wool caps while sleeping, despite the faintly comical silhouette they created. Pride yields quickly to frost. A small draught brushes the side of your face. You open your eyes and glance toward the wall. Somewhere between logs, the chinking has shrunk slightly in the cold. Temperature changes could cause mud or clay fillers to crack, allowing threads of icy air to slip through. During especially harsh winters, families sometimes reinforced these seams with scraps of cloth or paper pressed into gaps. Newspapers served as unexpected insulation, their pages layered inside walls or tucked into cracks. It was not elegant, but it slowed the invasion of wind. There is a lesser-known custom, recorded in some northern communities, where heated stones were wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of the bed before sleep. The stones warmed near the fire radiated heat slowly for an hour or more. You imagine the comfort of sliding your feet toward a pocket of stored warmth, feeling cold toes gradually thaw. Care had to be taken, of course, to ensure stones were dry and not hot enough to scorch fabric. Everything required balance. Outside, the wind lifts again, carrying a faint hiss across the snow. You lie still, listening. Long winter nights were shaped by sound as much as temperature. Wood contracting in the cold could produce sharp cracks that startled light sleepers. Snow sliding from the roof might thud softly against the ground. In isolated regions, the distant howl of wolves or coyotes threaded through darkness, a reminder that wilderness pressed close to cabin walls. Some historians continue to examine how winter darkness influenced sleep patterns in this era. Without electric light, people aligned more closely with the natural cycle of sunset and sunrise. In deep winter, that meant extended hours in bed, though not always continuous sleep. Letters from the period occasionally mention waking during the middle hours, tending the fire-whispering prayers, or simply lying awake in contemplation before drifting off again. You can feel that rhythm now suspended between awareness and rest. You adjust the quilt once more, smoothing it across your chest. The stitching catches faintly on your fingertips. Each seam represents hours of labour performed in better light months earlier. Preparing for winter was an act of foresight. A household that failed to mend clothing or thicken bedding before frost set in faced discomfort at best and illness at worst. It is also true that wealth made a noticeable difference. In urban homes of the upper classes, multiple fireplaces or early stoves might warm separate bedrooms. Thick carpets reduced drafts rising from floorboards. Heavy draperies covered windows. Yet even in those more comfortable settings, fuel consumption was a constant concern. Coal deliveries had to be secured, chimneys cleaned, fires managed. Winter respected no social boundary entirely. You draw your hands beneath the blanket and press them between your knees, conserving heat. Your breathing slows again. The cold no longer feels sharp but present like a distant observer. Your body has adjusted. Beneath layers of wool and cotton, a stable warmth forms once more. There is an interesting fragment from frontier folklore suggesting that sleeping slightly elevated from the floor improved warmth as cold air settled lower in the room. Whether scientifically precise or not, raised bedsteads were indeed common, keeping sleepers above drafts that crept along floorboards. You glance down toward the edge of the mattress, grateful for even that modest lift from the ground. Gradually your awareness softens. The room's outlines blur into shadow. The faint red at the hearth persists steady but subdued. Outside, the wind begins to quiet as if the world itself is settling. You realize that surviving a winter night in the 1800s is not about conquering cold entirely. It is about managing it through layers. Layers of fabric, layers of architecture, layers of routine and inherited knowledge. Each one adds a small measure of protection. None promise perfection. Your eyelids grow heavy once more. Beneath wool and quilt, your warmth holds. The chill at your nose becomes almost comforting proof that you are wrapped deeply enough to notice contrast. And so you sink again into the sleep bundled not only in cloth but in the careful preparations of a century that understood winter intimately and met it layer by patient layer without complaint. Sometime in the deeper stretch of night you become aware of another presence in the bed. Not a stranger, not a surprise, but the steady warmth of another body close beside you. In this century, solitude at night is often a luxury few can afford, especially in winter. Shared heat is practical, it is efficient, it is survival wrapped in human form. You feel the subtle rise and fall of breathing next to you. The quilt curves over both of you like a low tent trapping warmth in a shared pocket. When two bodies lie close, the temperature beneath blankets climbs noticeably. This is not sentimentality, it is physics. On the frontier and in rural towns, families frequently shared beds not only due to limited space, but because the cold demanded it. It's widely recognized that 19th century households often organized sleeping arrangements around age and need. Young children might sleep with parents during harsh weather. Older siblings shared with one another. In some cases, unrelated travelers boarding for the night shared beds with members of the household. Personal comfort was measured differently then. Warmth outweighed awkwardness. You shift slightly, careful not to disturb the person beside you. Their shoulder brushes yours, radiating heat. The air beneath the quilt feels softer, almost humid from combined breath. Outside that cocoon, the room remains crisp. You can sense the boundary where comfort ends and chill resumes. There is an odd comfort in the quiet sounds that accompany shared sleep. A faint rustle of linen, the slow exhale of someone already deeply asleep. The small creak of the bed ropes adjusting under distributed weight. These sounds weave together steady and reassuring. In a time when winter storms could isolate homes for weeks, the simple presence of another living body close by carried emotional as well as physical warmth. Some observers of the era noted that communal sleeping fostered resilience in children accustomed to winter hardship. Others have suggested that it simply reflected necessity rather than any deliberate philosophy. Researchers continue to explore how concepts of privacy evolved over time, particularly as industrialization and urban growth introduced larger homes and more separate bedrooms. For now, in this dim cabin, privacy is less important than shared survival. You tuck your arm closer to your chest, mindful of conserving your own warmth while benefiting from the heat beside you. The quilt rises slightly as your companion shifts. A small thread of cooler air slips in then fades as the fabric settles again. There is a curious detail preserved in certain immigrant communities where families intentionally arrange sleepers in specific patterns to maximize warmth. The youngest children were placed in the center of a bed flanked by older siblings or parents on either side, creating a natural barrier against drafts. Whether this was widespread or anecdotal remains uncertain, but the logic is easy to grasp. Protect the smallest with the warmth of the strongest. You listen to the wind outside, now softer, almost distant. Snow may be accumulating against the outer walls, adding another layer of insulation. What threatened earlier now shields. Winter, in its own paradoxical way, sometimes builds the very barrier that helps you endure it. Your thoughts drift to households larger than this one where multiple beds lined a single room. In farmhouses across New England or the Midwest, it was not unusual for 6 or more people to sleep within arm's reach of one another. The combined body heat significantly altered the microclimate of the space. Though temperatures might still hover near freezing at the edges of the room, the interior of shared bedding remained surprisingly warm. A small but fascinating note appears in some diaries describing how families measured the severity of a night by whether frost formed on interior walls by morning. When breath condensed and froze along the planks, it left delicate patterns that sparkled in early light. It was beautiful and unsettling at once. You imagine waking to such crystalline lace framing the window. The person beside you murmurs softly in their sleep, then grows still again. You feel the weight of their shoulder steady against yours. Shared warmth requires compromise. One cannot sprawl freely. Limbs must negotiate space. Yet there is a rhythm to it, an unspoken agreement shaped by long winters spent side by side. Modern sensibilities might recoil at the lack of personal space, but context matters. Heating entire separate rooms was impractical for most families. Concentrating bodies into blankets in one area conserved precious fuel. Wood supplies did not stretch endlessly. Coal, where available, required money and reliable transport. Every log saved during the night meant one more day secured against the relentless season. There is also the emotional layer of winter closeness. When darkness arrives early and lingers long, companionship eases the psychological weight of isolation. The quiet presence of another breathing human nearby reduces the sense of vulnerability that cold magnifies. You shift again, sliding your feet gently towards the warmest point beneath the quilt. Your toes brush against another pair, and instinctively both sets curl slightly, sharing heat. It is a small, almost unconscious gesture repeated countless times in countless cabins across the century. Some cultural traditions brought from Europe included the use of heavy communal bed coverings called coverlets woven thick and dense. These textiles often featured intricate patterns and family initials. Beyond decoration, their tight weave trapped warmth effectively. You imagine the weight of such a coverlet resting across both of you, pressing gently, holding the pocket of heat close. Your breathing slows, further sinking faintly with the rhythm beside you. The cabin feels smaller now, more intimate, reduced to the narrow circle of warmth beneath layered fabric. The wider room fades into shadow and chill. In this moment, winter feels less like an adversary and more like a boundary defining closeness. Outside, frost claims fields and forests. Inside, you and the one beside you generate a quiet counterforce measured not in flames but in shared breath. Gradually, awareness dissolves. The creak of wood and the whisper of wind blur into the background. Beneath woolen quilt, wrapped in human warmth, you drift deeper into sleep, carried by the simple physics and quiet intimacy that made survival possible through the coldest nights of 19th century America. At some quiet hour, when night feels thickest, you wake again. Not from cold this time, but from sound. The wind has returned with a different voice. It does not simply brush the cabin walls, it leans against them. You hear it travel across the roof, then sweep down along the logs with a low, steady moan. You remain still beneath the quilt, listening. In the darkness, sound becomes landscape. You can almost trace the shape of the land outside by the way the gusts move. A wide open field allows wind to gather speed before it strikes. A stand of trees might break it into uneven bursts. The cabin speaks through its timbers, answering each gust with a faint creak or shudder. Across much of northern America in the 19th century, blizzards were not rare spectacles but recurring events. Weather records and personal journals describe storms that lasted days, burying fences and swallowing roads. The Great Blizzard of 1888 in the Northeast stands as one well-known example, paralyzing cities and rural communities alike. Snowdrifts rose higher than doorways, trains stalled, communication lines snapped. Nights during such storms were long and uncertain. You shift slightly and pull the quilt closer around your shoulders. The warmth beside you remains steady, though you sense the air outside your small cocoon cooling further. The embers in the hearth must be lower now. The wind's voice grows sharper, slipping through some unseen crack and brushing your cheek with a thin blade of chill. It is said that experienced settlers could judge the severity of a storm by the tone of wind alone. A high, thin whistle signalled snow carried in fine grains. A deeper rolling sound hinted at heavier drifts forming against walls. Whether that skill was widespread or romanticised later is still discussed among researchers, but you can understand how attentive listening would become second nature. When your shelter is wood and mud, the wind's language matters. You hear a small thud outside, perhaps snow sliding from the roof, perhaps a loose shutter striking against its frame. For a brief moment your heart quickens. Winter nights amplify imagination. The darkness feels immense beyond the thin barrier of logs. Another sound rises faintly carried on the gusts, a distant animal call. It could be a coyote crossing frozen fields, its voice stretched thin in the cold air. In frontier regions, wildlife remained close to human settlements during winter, drawn by food scraps or livestock. The boundary between wilderness and home was porous. You are never entirely alone. Inside the cabin responds. A beam contracts with a sharp crack as temperature shifts. You have heard this before, yet it still surprises you. Wood shrinks in intense cold, producing sudden noises that echo in the stillness. Many a child in the 19th century lay awake convinced the house itself was groaning under winter's weight. You consider rising to check the hearth again, but hesitation holds you. Leaving the bed means surrendering accumulated warmth. The floor will be colder than before, the air sharper. You weigh the risk. The embers were healthy earlier. The wind, though persistent, has not yet overwhelmed the room. You decide to stay listening instead. A curious detail appears in some pioneer accounts describing how families sometimes stuffed extra cloth or even straw into window frames during active storms to muffle drafts and noise. Windows were often single pane and imperfectly sealed. Snow could gather in corners, melting slightly from interior heat before refreezing. The battle against infiltration was constant. You become aware of your own breathing again, steady and measured. The quilt lifts and falls gently. Beneath it, warmth remains contained. The presence beside you shifts slightly, then settles. Shared heat continues to counter the encroaching cold. Outside, the storm seems to intensify for a few minutes, wind striking in stronger bursts. Snow scrapes against the walls with a dry, rushing sound. You imagine drifts piling higher along the cabin's base, perhaps even reaching the lower edge of the window. In some cases, settlers awoke after severe storms to find doors partially buried, requiring shoveling from inside to push them open. Morning could bring its own labour. Weather forecasting as we know it did not exist for most of the century. People relied on observation, folklore and experience. A red sky at dusk, a sudden drop in pressure felt in aching joints. The behaviour of animals, none guaranteed accuracy. When night fell and wind rose, you simply endured. The sound gradually shifts again, the gusts lose some of their edge, the rhythm becomes less aggressive, more distant. Perhaps the storm is passing. Perhaps it is only pausing. You lie still, allowing the tension in your shoulders to ease. There is a strange intimacy in listening to wind while sheltered. It reminds you of the thinness of your protection. A few inches of timber and clay stand between you and the vast frozen dark. Yet those few inches, combined with fire and fabric, are enough. That realization carries a quiet kind of awe. You think briefly of those who travel during winter nights. Stagecoach drivers, railroad workers, hunters caught far from shelter. Their experience of wind would have been direct and punishing. Compared to that exposure, this cabin feels almost luxurious. Your eyelids grow heavier once more. The wind's voice recedes into background murmur. The cabin settles. The embers in the hearth emit one last faint crackle. Beneath layered wool and shared warmth, you begin to drift again. The storm outside continues its restless movement across fields and forests, but inside your small wooden refuge sound softens into a distant lullaby. Winter may press close to the walls, but for now it remains outside and you slip back into sleep while the wind keeps watch. By the time you stir again, the storm has softened to a low murmur. But the cold has grown sharper. It feels different now, less dramatic than wind, more insistent. You sense it along the edges of the room, creeping inward, inch by inch. The warmth beneath your blankets holds steady, yet beyond that small cocoon the air has thinned into something brittle. You open your eyes and peer toward the faint outline of the wall. Even in darkness, you can almost trace where drafts slip through. Frontier cabins were rarely airtight. Logs shifted as they aged. Clay chinking dried and cracked. Winter exploited every imperfection. Across much of rural America in the 19th century, families spent considerable time sealing gaps before the first deep freeze. Moss-mud strips of cloth and even old paper were pressed into seams between logs. This was not decorative work. It was defensive. Contemporary accounts from settlers in the Midwest frequently mention autumn days devoted entirely to reinforcing walls against what they knew was coming. Preparation was a seasonal ritual as predictable as harvest. You ease yourself upright, careful not to disturb the sleeper beside you. The quilt falls slightly and a breath of cold grazes your neck. The floor greets your feet with a quiet sting. You cross to the wall, guided by memory more than sight. Running your fingers along a seam, you find it. A faint stream of icy air brushes your knuckles. The chinking has pulled back slightly, perhaps from repeated freezing and thawing. In daylight, this would be simple to fix. At night, it feels like a small emergency. There is an anecdote preserved in some prairie diaries describing how families tucked pages from old almanacs into cracks as temporary insulation. The printed words disappeared into walls, serving a purpose far more urgent than reading. It is a practical irony that weather predictions might literally block the weather itself. You glance around for a scrap of cloth. A worn handkerchief rests on a nearby peg. Folding it once, you press it firmly into the gap. The draft softens immediately. The room still feels cold, but the sharp edge fades. Small interventions mattered. In an environment where temperatures could drop well below freezing, even a thin ribbon of air could sap comfort over hours. Researchers continued to discuss how effective these improvised sealing methods truly were. Some suggest that many cabins remained perpetually drafty despite best efforts, while others point to regional variations in craftsmanship. Log construction in older eastern settlements often achieved tighter joints than hastily built structures on the expanding frontier. As with so much of 19th century life, quality depended on time, skill, and available materials. You return to the bed and slip back beneath the quilt. The contrast between exposed air and sheltered warmth feels dramatic. Your body welcomes the cocoon. You tuck your knees upward, minimizing the surface area that meets the cold. The embers in the hearth glow faintly, though weaker than before. You consider rising again to feed them, but hesitate. Fuel must be rationed. Wood supplies were calculated carefully across the winter months. In heavily wooded regions, gathering more might be possible, though never easy. On the open plains, timber was precious. Settlers sometimes travelled miles to collect usable wood. Burning too freely at night could mean discomfort later in the season. An established historical observation notes that some families slept in closer proximity to the hearth during severe cold, even dragging bedding nearer to the fireplace. The room's geography shifted with temperature. Space was rearranged not for aesthetics but for survival. You imagine moving the entire bed a few feet closer to the glow, narrowing the distance between sleep and flame. The cabin creaks softly as the temperature continues to fall. Wood fibers tighten. The roof emits a faint ticking sound. These noises, once alarming, now blend into the background of winter. A lesser-known practice in certain northern communities involved hanging thick woven rugs or spare quilts along interior walls during extreme cold spells. These acted as an additional barrier against drafts, particularly on walls facing prevailing winds. The cabin became layered inside and out, wrapped like a body beneath extra garments. You pull the blankets slightly higher and adjust your wool cap. Your breath warms the air beneath the quilt, creating a faint pocket of moisture that lingers briefly before fading. Even condensation becomes part of the equation. Too much dampness could chill you later. Too little, and the air felt dry and biting. There is a quiet resilience in these small acts of adjustment. You are not conquering winter. You are negotiating with it moment by moment. Each draft plugged each layer, straightened each ember, preserved, extends your comfort a little longer. Some scholars continue to examine whether the constant presence of cold-shaped temperament in frontier communities did enduring such nights cultivate patience and thrift. Or were these traits already present, merely sharpened by climate? The question remains open yet lying here. You sense how repeated winters might carve certain habits into a person's character. The wind outside has nearly faded now. Snow rests thick against the cabin walls, pressing gently, insulating as it accumulates. What once howled now muffles. The world beyond feels hushed, almost suspended. Within your small shelter, the draft you plugged no longer brushes your skin. The room remains cold but stable. Beneath layered wool and shared warmth, you feel secure again. Gradually your breathing deepens. The awareness that pulled you from sleep recedes. The cabin, imperfect yet steadfast, holds against the frozen night. And as you settle once more beneath quilt and careful preparation, you realize that winter survival in this era is built not from grand gestures, but from countless quiet corrections made in darkness. You drift in and out of sleep again, and when you next surface, the silence is what strikes you first. The wind has withdrawn entirely. The cabin no longer creaks in protest. Instead, there is a dense stillness pressing gently on every surface. Even your own breathing seems louder in the quiet. You open your eyes and sense that something outside has changed. The air feels heavier, though not colder. There is a muted quality to the darkness, as if the world has been wrapped in wool. Snow has done its quiet work. In many northern regions of 19th century America, people observed that deep snow, once settled, could actually improve indoor comfort. A thick drift packed against exterior walls acted as a natural insulator, blocking wind and reducing drafts. This was not folklore, but practical experience repeated across winters. Cabins partially buried by snow often retained heat better than those exposed to relentless wind. You imagine stepping outside at dawn and finding the lower half of the cabin hugged by white mounds. You remain beneath the quilt, considering this paradox. The same storm that threatened to freeze everything solid now offers a kind of protection. Snow muffles sound, seals cracks, and softens sharp edges. It transforms a hostile landscape into something almost gentle in appearance. There is a faint glow at the window, barely perceptible. Not sunrise yet, but the subtle reflection of snow, amplifying what little light the moon or distant stars provide. Snow brightens night in an unexpected way. In some diary entries from frontier settlers, there are descriptions of winter evenings so luminous that outdoor chores could be completed without lanterns. The ground itself seemed to shine. You shift slightly and feel the mattress beneath you warmer now than at any point earlier in the night. Your body heat has accumulated within layers of wool and quilt trapped effectively. The shared warmth beside you remains steady. The cocoon you built hours ago has held. There is a small but charming observation recorded in certain rural communities where children were told that snow was winter's blanket for the earth. While poetic, it also contained a kernel of truth. Snow covering crops and soil insulated roots from extreme cold, preserving life beneath the surface. In a similar way, it now shields your cabin walls. The same principle that protects winter wheat protects you. You listen carefully. No scraping wind, no shifting beams, only the faintest crackle from embers nearly spent. The fire's red heart has dimmed to a whisper, but it is still alive. You feel a quiet satisfaction in that. The banking technique worked. There remains, however, the reality that once morning arrives, someone must rise quickly to revive the flame before the room chills further. Allowing embers to die entirely would mean starting from cold ash, a slower and more demanding process. Many households in this era treated the morning fire as the first and most urgent task of the day. Some historians continue to explore how winter routines shaped daily schedules. When nights were long and fuel-precious families often retired early and rose early, aligning closely with available light. The snow's reflective glow may have subtly extended useful hours, but true illumination remained limited. Candles and oil lamps were used sparingly. Darkness was accepted rather than resisted. You feel a slight tickle of cold along your cheek where the quilt has shifted. Carefully you adjust it, sealing your small refuge once more. Beneath the covers, the air feels warmer than the room by several degrees. This difference, though modest, is enough. Outside, the snow settles deeper, compressing under its own weight. In some regions, prolonged accumulation could create tunnels and pathways carved directly through drifts. Children delighted in them by day. Adults measured them anxiously, knowing that each inch of snow represented labour to come. Shoveling paths to barns and wells was not optional. You allow your thoughts to wander briefly to livestock sheltered nearby. In certain farmsteads, barns were built close to the house not only for convenience but to create a partial windbreak. Animals themselves generated heat. In extreme cold, some farmers even positioned livestock strategically to shield structures from prevailing winds. Winter encouraged cooperation between species as much as between people. The silence continues, thick and velvety. Snow has transformed the soundscape. Even distant animal calls are absorbed, softened into near-nothingness. It feels as though the world has paused. There is a gentle rhythm now to your breathing and that of the sleeper beside you. The quilt rises and falls in unison. Beneath its weight you feel secure in a way that might have seemed unlikely hours earlier, when wind howled and drafts crept. Some researchers still debate whether winter conditions contributed to longer periods of indoor storytelling and communal reflection. When storms confined families inside for days, evenings were filled with conversation reading aloud or simple shared silence. These traditions may have deepened familial bonds in ways summer labour did not permit. Lying here, you sense how such closeness grows naturally from necessity. The faint glow at this window strengthens almost imperceptibly. Dawn is approaching. The coldest hour often comes just before sunrise when embers are weakest and night has stretched to its limit, yet beneath your layers warmth persists. You close your eyes once more, allowing yourself a final descent into a sleep before morning duties call. Snow presses gently against the cabin, insulating and still. The storm that once roared now rests like a thick quilt over the land, and within your own quilted refuge you drift peacefully sheltered by timber ash and the quiet generosity of freshly fallen snow. A faint greyness begins to seep through the window, barely enough to distinguish wall from ceiling. You sense it even before you fully wake. The cold has sharpened slightly again, as it often does just before sunrise. The embers in the hearth are at their weakest point, reduced to a low red glow that flickers uncertainly beneath a thin crust of ash. You know what must be done. Morning in the coldest months does not begin gently, Sylvie. It begins with fire. Carefully you slip beneath the quilt, trying not to release too much of the warmth you have gathered through the night. The air bites instantly at your face and hands. The floor is colder than it was hours ago. For a brief second you consider retreating under the covers, but winter does not reward hesitation. You kneel before the hearth and study the coals. They are faint but alive. This is the small victory earned by careful banking before sleep. Many 19th century households depended entirely on preserving a core of embers overnight. Matches were not as ubiquitous as they would later become, and striking a new flame from scratch could be slow and uncertain. Keeping the fire alive in some form was both practical and symbolic. It is a well-established historical detail that before the widespread availability of friction matches in the mid-19th century, fire starting often relied on flint and steel or preserved coals. Even after matches became more common, they were used sparingly in rural areas where supplies had to be purchased and transported. A living ember was a form of security. You take the poker and gently break apart the ash crust. A small pulse of orange brightens. Relief washes through you. You add a twist of dry kindling, thin and patient, and lean close to blow softly. Your breath feeds the ember. The wood catches slowly, then more confidently. A thin flame curls upward. The room seems to exhale with you. As the fire strengthens, you add a slightly larger piece of wood, careful not to smother the fragile flame. The crackle grows louder, more assured. Heat begins its slow outward spread, subtle at first, but unmistakable. Behind you, the sleeper in the bed stirs. They pull the quilt higher around their shoulders, lingering in the last pocket of warmth while you tend the hearth. This division of labour was common. In many households, one person rose first to coax the fire back to life, while others remained under blankets as long as possible. Efficiency mattered. Outside, the light grows stronger. Snow reflects dawn in pale silver tones. You can see faint ridges of drift through the window, now piled high against the lower logs. The cabin appears partially embraced by white. What threatened during the night now provides a quiet seal. There is a practical reality tied to this hour. Once the fire is steady, other tasks follow quickly. Water may have frozen in well-led buckets. Livestock will need tending. Paths to the barn or well must be cleared. Winter mornings were laborious, and the warmth of bed faded quickly into memory as responsibilities pressed in. A lesser-known custom in certain frontier communities involved saving a small portion of the previous night's ashes to sprinkle over icy steps or pathways. The fine grit provided traction, reducing slips on packed snow. Even ash had purpose beyond the hearth. Nothing was wasted. The fire now burns with steady confidence. You hold your hands toward it, feeling sensation return fully to your fingers. The room remains cold, but a slow change is underway. Heat radiates outward, meeting the lingering chill in a quiet contest. Researchers continues to examine how the architecture of winter mornings shaped family rhythms. With limited daylight, tasks were often prioritized carefully. The fire had to be strong enough to warm food preparation and thaw tools. Children might remain bundled under quilts while adults handled early chores. In larger households, the choreography of movement around a single hearth required coordination and patience. You rise and move toward the window, brushing away a thin layer of frost from the inside pane with your sleeve. The glass is cold enough to sting. Through it you see a world transformed. Snow blankets every surface, smoothing fences and fields into soft contours. Smoke from neighbouring chimneys rises straight upward. In the still air, thin grey lines against pale sky. Each column of smoke signals another household engaged in the same morning ritual. There is a quiet camaraderie in that sight. Across valleys and plains, others are coaxing embers into flame, rubbing warmth into stiff hands, stepping cautiously into snow. Winter is endured collectively, even when cabins stand far apart. You turn back towards the hearth and add another log. The fire responds eagerly now, licking along the wood with brighter tongues of orange. The room begins to feel less hostile. Behind you the bed rustles again. Soon others will rise. Quilts will be folded back. The stored warmth of night will dissipate into motion. It is tempting to linger in the memory of shared heat beneath wool and patchwork. Yet winter survival in the 1800s required constant engagement. Sleep was only one chapter in a larger daily negotiation with cold. Still, as the fire grows stronger and light fills the room, you allow yourself a brief moment of satisfaction. You have made it through the night. The embers survived. The draughts were managed. The storm passed. The coldest hours have yielded to morning. And as you stand before the revived hearth, hands extended toward its rising warmth, you feel the quiet resilience that carried countless families through the frozen nights of 19th century America, one careful sunrise at a time. The fire steadies into a confident glow, and with it the room begins to feel almost hospitable. Not warm in the modern sense, but no longer hostile. You feed another measured piece of wood into the hearth and watch the flames stretch upward, licking along bark and sap. The crackle grows rhythmic, almost conversational. Your hands hover close to the heat. Sensation returns fully to your fingertips, replacing the dull stiffness that greeted you moments ago. Morning in the coldest months always begins this way. First reclaim warmth, then reclaim motion. You glance toward the water bucket near the door. A thin crust of ice has formed across the top. This was a familiar sight in many 19th century homes during deep winter. Even indoors, water could partially freeze overnight when fires were banked low. It is a small but telling reminder that comfort was relative. The line between inside and outside remained thin. You lift the bucket carefully and carry it closer to the hearth. The ice will soften soon enough. In some households, kettles were kept near the fire overnight not only for convenience but to prevent complete freezing. Hot water was a luxury earned through vigilance. Breath still clouds faintly in the air when you exhale away from the hearth. Indoor winter air in this era was often both cold and dry, punctuated by moments of dampness near the fire. Some medical writings of the time warned that extreme dryness could irritate lungs and throats, though understanding of respiratory illness remained limited. What families knew through experience was simple. Warmth soothed, cold aggravated. You rub your hands together and step back toward the bed. The sleeper beside you stirs more fully now, blinking against the grey light filtering through frost-edged glass. The quilt slides down slightly, releasing a small puff of retained warmth into the room. It dissipates quickly. There is a widely acknowledged fact that many 19th century homes lacked separate heated rooms. Mornings meant leaving the relative comfort of shared bedding and entering colder air. Children often dressed quickly beneath blankets before emerging fully into the room. Modesty and practicality merged in those moments. You gather your heavier outer garments from their peg near the hearth. The fabric feels stiff from the chill, though it will soften as the fire strengthens. Pulling on layers becomes its own ritual. Shirt, waistcoat, thicker coat. Each piece serves as portable insulation once you step away from the fire's immediate reach. A small detail noted in several pioneer accounts describes how some families kept boots near the hearth overnight so leather would remain pliable rather than freezing solid. Hard frozen boots could crack when forced onto feet. You glance at your own pair and nudge them slightly closer to the warmth. Care for objects was as vital as care for people. Outside, dawn grows brighter. The world beyond the window gleams with pale blue light reflecting off snow. Smoke from distant cabins drifts lazily upward. Each plume signals another morning shaped by embers and patience. The fire now emits a steadier wave of heat. You lift the lid of a small iron pot resting nearby and place it on the crane over the flames. Soon water will simmer ready for simple breakfast or to warm chilled hands. Cooking and heating were inseparable in homes of this period. The hearth functioned as stove furnace and gathering place all at once. Scholars continue to explore how the architecture of winter kitchens influenced social life. With so much activity centered around one fire, families naturally congregated in close proximity. Stories were shared, plans were made, arguments likely unfolded as well. Heat drew people together physically and emotionally. You kneel once more and adjust a log, ensuring even burn. The smell of wood smoke thickens, slightly rich and familiar. It clings to clothing and hair throughout the season. In winter, the scent of smoke becomes almost synonymous with home. There is an unusual anecdote from certain northern settlements where families hung small sprigs of evergreen inside during winter months, believing the scent improved the air. While perhaps symbolic, it also added a faint freshness to rooms that could otherwise feel heavy with smoke and wool. You imagine that subtle pine fragrance mingling with the sharper aroma of burning oak. Behind you, blankets rustle as the bed is abandoned. Feet touch cold floorboards with quick, sharp breaths. The day cannot be delayed. Livestock must be checked, paths cleared, water fetched. Winter demands movement. Yet before you step fully into that routine, you pause at the hearth one more time. The fire stands revived, bright and steady. The small victory of maintaining embers through the night has extended into morning warmth. You think briefly of the countless families who repeated this cycle year after year, banking coals at dusk, listening to wind, plugging draughts, rising before dawn to coax flame from ash. It was not dramatic heroism, it was disciplined repetition. The cabin, now illuminated by full morning light, reveals frost-tracing, delicate patterns along the inside of the window. Ice crystals form feathery shapes, fragile and intricate. They will melt slowly as the room warms, leaving small rivulets down the glass. Even beauty in winter carries a chill. You straighten, feeling the first true comfort of the day settle into your bones as heat spreads more evenly. Outside, the snow waits in silent drifts. Inside, fire and fabric have once again held against the coldest hours. And as you step into the rhythm of the morning, you carry with you the quiet understanding that every restful winter night in 19th century America depended on this careful partnership between vigilance and warmth, repeated faithfully with each rising sun. The morning settles into motion, but your mind drifts back to the night just past. Not every family in the 1800s relied on timber walls and raised bedsteads. Out on the wide open plains, especially in newly settled territories, wood was scarce. Trees did not line every horizon. In some places, they barely existed at all. You step outside in your thoughts and imagine a different kind of shelter. Instead of logs stacked one upon another, you see walls carved directly from earth. Sod houses, sometimes called soddies, rose from the prairie itself. Thick blocks of grass and soil were cut and stacked like bricks, their roots interwoven their mass that's surprisingly solid. It is well recorded that during the homestead era, particularly in the Great Plains during the latter half of the 19th century, thousands of families built sod homes because lumber was either too expensive or too distant to acquire. These dwellings were not temporary experiments. Many stood for years. Their walls, sometimes 2 feet thick, provided remarkable insulation against both summer heat and winter cold. You imagine lying down at night inside one of these earthbound homes. The ceiling might be supported by timber beams if available, or even by rough poles and brush layered beneath soil. The interior would feel dim, the light filtered and muted. The smell would carry a faint earthy scent, especially after snowfall or rain. There is something deeply grounding about sleeping within walls that once formed the open prairie. The earth itself becomes your barrier against winter. Thick sod blocks slow the transfer of cold, and once heated, they release warmth gradually through the night. Unlike thin wooden boards that contract sharply in freezing air, packed soil holds steady. Some researchers have explored whether sod houses maintained more stable nighttime temperatures than early wooden cabins. Evidence suggests that while sod homes could be damp and prone to leaking in heavy rain, they often performed admirably in extreme cold. The thermal mass of earth provided a consistent buffer against temperature swings. You picture yourself settling into a bed tucked against one of those earthen walls. The mattress might still be stuffed with straw or corn husks. Quilts would still be layered thick. Yet the feeling around you would differ. Instead of wind-rattling boards, there would be a subdued hush. Snow drifting against a sod wall might blend almost seamlessly with the structure itself, further enhancing insulation. There is an intriguing tidbit from accounts of prairie settlers who sometimes found wildflowers sprouting from their sod roofs in spring. Seeds embedded in the blocks would awaken once warmth returned. Imagine waking from a long winter and seeing small blossoms above your head. Even shelter held the memory of grassland life. The fire inside a sod home functioned much like any other hearth, though smoke management could prove challenging. Chimneys were constructed carefully to prevent collapse and ensure proper draft. In winter, maintaining airflow without losing too much heat required attention. Yet once the fire burned steadily, the thick earthen walls would absorb and radiate warmth in a way thin timber could not. Scholars continue to discuss how living in such close contact with the earth shaped settlers' psychological experience of winter. Did sod walls feel more secure because they were thick and immovable? Or did the lack of windows and light intensify feelings of isolation? Diaries offer mixed impressions. Some writers praised the snug warmth, others lamented darkness and occasional dampness. You imagine lying there during a prairie blizzard. The wind might roar above, sweeping across open land without obstruction. Snow would pile high against the low structure, sometimes nearly covering it. Inside, however, the earth holds steady. The sound of wind is muffled, filtered through layers of soil and grass roots. The world beyond feels distant. Shared sleeping arrangements would remain much the same. families clustered together beneath quilts, children tucked into the warmest centre spots. Heated stones or bricks might still be slipped beneath blankets. Practical solutions travelled easily from one type of dwelling to another. Morning in a sod house would bring its own challenges. If snow had drifted high against the door, someone might have to dig outward before stepping into daylight. The first task, as always, would be coaxing the fire. Even thick earthen walls could not maintain warmth indefinitely without renewed flame. Yet there is something undeniably effective about sleeping within the land itself. You picture resting with your back against packed soil, feeling a subtle steadiness beneath layers of fabric. The prairie may stretch vast and exposed outside, but within these walls winter is softened. Another documented detail from the period reveals that some sod homes were partially dug into hillsides, creating a hybrid between a cabin and an earth shelter. These structures took advantage of natural contours to shield against wind. Positioning mattered deeply. A home set into the lee side of a rise experienced far less direct exposure than one standing alone on flat ground. You return in your thoughts to your own wooden cabin warmed by revived embers. The methods differ, yet the goal remains constant: create a barrier, trap warmth, endure the night. Across the American landscape of the 1800s, solutions varied according to environment and resources. Timber forests, rolling hills, open-poured plains. Each demanded adaptation. Each shaped the experience of winter sleep in distinct ways. And as you consider those earthen walls and prairie roofs sprouting flowers in spring, you sense a quiet ingenuity threaded through these choices. When wood was scarce, the land itself became shelter. When wind was fierce, thickness and mass became allies. Sleep in the coldest winters was never accidental. It was engineered carefully, sometimes from logs, sometimes from silt soil, always from knowledge passed quietly between neighbours and generations. And whether beneath timber beams or sod blocks, the night was met with patience, preparation, and a steadfast refusal to let winter take more than it must. Not everyone facing winter nights in the 1800s slept in cabins or sod houses. As towns grew and cities expanded, a different kind of winter shelter emerged. You picture yourself now inside a boarding house in a bustling northeastern city. The walls are plastered rather than rough timber. The floors creak with the weight of many tenants moving through narrow hallways. Outside, snow still falls, but it lands on cobblestone streets instead of open prairie. You climb a dim staircase to a rented room no larger than the cabin you left behind in memory. The bed stands against one wall, its frame painted rather than raw wood. A small iron stove sits in the corner connected to a thin pipe that disappears into the ceiling. Coal rather than logs fuels the heat. The scent is different, sharper, almost metallic compared to wood smoke. By the mid-19th century, coal had become a dominant heating source in many American cities, particularly in the Northeast, where transportation networks made delivery feasible. Railroads and canals allowed bulk shipments from mining regions. This shift altered the character of winter nights. Coal burned longer and more steadily than many types of wood, producing consistent heat within enclosed stoves. Urban sleep gained a new steadiness, though it brought its own hazards. You crouch beside the stove and open its small iron door. Inside, a bed of glowing coals radiates warmth more evenly than an open hearth. The metal casing contains sparks and directs heat outward. Cast iron stoves grew increasingly common in the decades before the Civil War, prized for efficiency. Manufacturers advertised them as modern improvements that conserved fuel while maximizing comfort. Still, comfort in a boarding house was relative. Walls between rooms were often thin. Drafts slipped through ill-fitted windows. You might hear the cough of a neighbour in the next chamber, or the faint murmur of the conversation below. Privacy remained limited, though warmth was generally more reliable than in a remote homestead. There is a charming detail from certain urban lodging houses, where proprietors provided heated bricks to tenants on especially frigid nights. These bricks, warmed in the stove, were wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of beds. The practice mirrored rural customs, proving that practical wisdom travelled from countryside to city. You slip beneath blankets in this imagined city room. The mattress is likely stuffed with straw or perhaps horsehair. Feather beds exist, but they are not universal. Quilts and wool blankets still serve as primary insulation. The difference lies in the steady glow of the iron stove. Its heat persists through the night with less tending than an open hearth requires. Historians continue to discuss how industrialization subtly reshaped domestic routines. The introduction of manufactured heating appliances reduced some of the nightly vigilance that earlier households maintained. Yet coal brought new concerns. Chimney soot could accumulate dangerously. Poor ventilation might allow fumes to build. Newspaper reports from the era occasionally mention tragedies linked to faulty stoves or blocked flues. Warmth carried risk in every setting. You lie on your back and listen. Instead of wind pressing against logs, you hear distant carriage wheels crunching over snow. Perhaps a street vendor calls faintly in the early evening hours. The city does not fall silent as completely as Prairieland. Even in winter, it hums softly. Another established observation from 19th century urban life is that many working-class families crowded into single rooms during winter to conserve heat. Entire households might eat, work and sleep in one space warmed by a single stove. Boarding houses extended this pattern, clustering unrelated individuals under one roof to share fuel costs. Winter encouraged collective arrangements even in cities. You pull the blanket closer around your shoulders. The iron stove emits a steady low tick as its metal expands and contracts. The sound is different from wood cracking in a hearth, more rhythmic and contained. Heat radiates outward in a consistent circle. The air near the ceiling grows warmer than that near the floor, creating subtle temperature layers within the room. There is a lesser-known curiosity recorded in certain city memoirs, describing how some tenants hung damp laundry near stoves at night to increase humidity in overly dry rooms. Coal heat could parch the air, irritating throats and skin. A small basin of water placed atop the stove served a similar purpose. Balancing warmth and moisture became part of winter sleep strategy. You close your eyes and imagine the layers of city around you. Snow falling between tall brick buildings, chimneys releasing smoke into grey skies, countless small rooms glowing faintly from within. Each holds someone tucked beneath blankets, trusting iron and coal to hold back the cold. Scholars still explore whether urban dwellers experienced winter differently from rural settlers in emotional terms. Did the proximity of neighbours ease isolation, or did crowded conditions intensify stress during long cold months? Letters and diaries reveal both comfort and complaint. The stove's steady warmth gradually seeps into the mattress beneath you. Unlike a cabin hearth that might fade unpredictably, this contained fire offers reassurance through its constancy. You sense that sleep may come more quickly here, less interrupted by concern over embers. Yet even in this urban room, winter remains present. Frost may gather along the window edges. Drafts still slip beneath doors. You might wake at dawn to find ice forming in the wash basin if the fire has dwindled. Progress is uneven, comfort partial. As you drift towards sleep in this city setting, you recognize that the fundamental principles remain unchanged. Shelter must trap heat. Fire must be managed. Layers must be arranged carefully. Whether in a timber cabin, a sod dwelling, or a boarding house warmed by coal survival through the coldest nights depends on preparation and patience. And as the iron stove ticks softly beside you, casting a steady glow across plaster walls, you surrender once more to rest wrapped in wool and urban ingenuity, while winter presses quietly against brick and stone beyond the window. Now your thoughts travel to a very different space, one that history too often describes only in fragments. You stand outside a small cabin set apart from a larger plantation house in the American South. Snow is less common here than in the northern states, yet cold winter nights still settle across fields and forests. Frost glitters on the ground. The air carries a damp chill that seeps into bone just as surely as northern wind. You step inside the cabin. The room is modest, often constructed from rough timber, with fewer materials devoted to insulation. Enslaved families in the 19th century frequently lived in quarters built quickly and cheaply, prioritizing economy over comfort. While winters in the deep south were milder than in New England, cold snaps could still bring freezing temperatures, especially overnight. It is an established fact that housing conditions for enslaved people were typically inferior to those of the enslaver's main house. Chimneys might be poorly constructed. Floors could be simple packed earth. Windows, if present, were small and sometimes lacked proper shutters. Warmth required ingenuity and resilience. You kneel beside a small hearth. The fire here is smaller, fueled by whatever wood scraps could be gathered or provided. Resources were limited, yet the same principles of survival applied. Bank the coals carefully, preserve heat through the night, protect the youngest first. There is a poignant detail recorded in some narratives from formerly enslaved individuals who recalled sleeping multiple family members in a single bed or on pallets laid close to the hearth during winter. Shared body heat compensated for thin walls and sparse blankets. Quilts, when available, were treasured possessions. Many were sewn from cast-off fabric pieced together with skill and quiet pride. You imagine lying down on a simple pallet near the fire. The floor beneath may be hard-packed earth, cool and slightly uneven. A thin mattress stuffed with straw or corn shucks offers modest cushioning. Over you perhaps one or two quilts heavy with stitching and memory. Researchers continue to examine the daily realities of winter in enslaved quarters, piecing together evidence from oral histories, plantation records and archaeological findings. There is ongoing discussion about how much autonomy individuals had in managing their own heating arrangements, and whether additional materials were sometimes gathered discreetly to improve insulation. What remains clear is that winter did not pause the hardships already present. The cold in this region often carried dampness rather than deep snow. Moist air slipping through cracks could chill clothing and bedding quickly. Keeping fabric dry was as important as generating heat. Some accounts mention hanging quilts near the fire during the day to remove lingering moisture before nightfall. You stretch out beside the hearth and feel its warmth strongest on one side of your body. The other side remains cooler, exposed to air that circulates through the cabin. You curl slightly, minimizing that exposure. Nearby, others settle into sleep, their breathing steady and close. A lesser-known anecdote describes how in some southern communities in slavery, families sang softly in the evenings during winter, voices low and rhythmic. The songs were not only expressions of faith or sorrow, but also a way to pass time as darkness lengthened. Music filled space that cold might otherwise dominate. You close your eyes and listen in your imagination to that gentle humming. Outside, frost forms along the edges of the small window. The night stretches long, yet within the cabin there is warmth created not only by fire, but by proximity and shared endurance. Even in regions where snowfall was rare, severe cold spells could damage crops and threaten livestock. Winter nights carried economic consequences as well as physical discomfort. Plantations and small farms alike monitored temperature anxiously, knowing that frost could undo months of labour. Scholars continue to debate how climate variations across the American South influenced housing design and winter preparedness. Some argue that milder averages led to less emphasis on insulation, leaving structures vulnerable during unusual cold snaps. Others note regional adaptations, such as thicker walls in certain areas or the strategic placement of cabins near natural windbreaks. You sense the fragility of this shelter. Unlike the sod house embedded in prairie soil or the urban boarding house warmed by coal, this cabin relies heavily on a single small fire and the closeness of its occupants. Yet resilience thrives even in constrained circumstances. The embers glow softly, casting faint light across rough walls. Shadows move gently as flames flicker. Quilts rise and fall with the breathing. The room smells of smoke, wool, and earth. You recognize that surviving winter in this setting required both physical and emotional strength. Heat might be scarce, materials limited, yet the nightly ritual of gathering, close banking the fire and trusting dawn to return remained constant. As you drift towards sleep in this humble cabin, you understand that winter nights touched every corner of 19th century America differently, yet the core strategies remained remarkably similar. Shelter, fire, fabric, proximity. And within these walls, however modest, those elements combine once more to hold back the chill, allowing rest to come even when comfort is incomplete. Now your thoughts travel across the ocean and back again, following the quiet thread of memory that immigrants carried with them into American winters. You imagine stepping into a modest farmhouse somewhere in the upper Midwest built by a family who once knew the long frozen nights of Scandinavia, or the damp chill of Ireland, or the alpine cold of Germany. Outside, snow drifts along fence lines. Inside, practices learned in another land shape the way you prepare for sleep. The room feels familiar and unfamiliar at once. Timber walls perhaps resemble those left behind, yet the landscape beyond the window is new. Still, winter speaks a language that transcends borders. Cold is cold, whether on a Norwegian fjord or a Minnesota prairie. It's well documented that many immigrant communities in the 19th century brought architectural and domestic traditions from Europe that influenced how they endured winter. Scandinavian settlers in particular were accustomed to insulating homes carefully and building compact structures to retain heat. In some Midwestern settlements, log construction techniques mirrored those of Northern Europe with tightly fitted joints that minimize drafts. You kneel near a cast-iron stove that glows steadily in the corner. The family may have invested in this stove early, recognizing its efficiency compared to an open hearth. The iron radiates warmth evenly, and a small kettle hums softly atop it. The air feels slightly drier here, the heat more contained. You return to the bed, where thick woven coverlets lie folded at the foot. In certain immigrant households, textiles carried patterns and weaving techniques passed down for generations. These were not merely decorative items, they were tools of survival tightly woven to trap warmth effectively. There is an intriguing detail from some German-American communities where feather beds were especially prized. Feathers provided superior insulation and softness, and many families prioritized acquiring them even when other comforts were sparse. You imagine sinking into such a bed, the feathers shifting gently beneath you, molding to your shape while holding heat close. researchers continues to explore how much old world knowledge adapted seamlessly to American conditions and how much required modification. European winters varied widely, and not all traditions translated perfectly to prairie storms or Appalachian cold. Yet the instinct to layer bedding, seal windows, and cluster sleeping spaces remained constant. You pull a wool blanket up to your chin and notice its thickness. In some immigrant homes, wool production was a household task. Sheep were kept not only for meat but for fibre. Spinning and weaving became winter activities conducted near the stove while snow piled outside. The very blankets that protect you tonight may have been crafted during a previous season of cold. A small but charming custom appears in certain Scandinavian American accounts describing the placement of a small decorative textile over the foot of the bed, believed to bring comfort and ward off restless dreams. Whether symbolic or practical, it added an extra layer of fabric where feet often felt coldest. You lie back and listen to the stove's quiet ticking as it adjusts to shifting temperatures. The room feels snug, compact. Windows are covered not only by glass but by thick curtains drawn tight against the night. In some homes, additional boards were placed over the windows during extreme cold to reduce heat loss further. Light sacrificed for warmth. Outside, the wind brushes across open fields, but the house stands firm. Snow gathers against its foundation, adding natural insulation, much like in other regions. The difference lies in the deliberate planning that preceded this night. Many immigrant families selected building sites, carefully choosing slopes or sheltered valleys that mimicked familiar landscapes from home. Scholars still examine how these transplanted building practices shaped settlement patterns across the American Midwest. Clusters of homes built by families from the same region of Europe often shared architectural similarities, creating microclimates of familiarity in a vast new land. You shift beneath the blankets and feel the steady warmth radiating from the stove. Unlike the fluctuating glow of an open hearth, this heat persists with quiet reliability. Coal or carefully rationed wood feeds it. The result is a room that cools more slowly overnight. There is a widely recognized historical observation that as the century progressed, technological improvements in heating slowly altered expectations of comfort. What earlier generations accepted as tolerable chill began to feel unnecessary in homes equipped with better stoves. Yet adaptation remained uneven. Rural isolation and economic limits meant many families continued traditional methods long after newer options existed. You close your eyes and imagine the blend of languages spoken earlier in the evening. Perhaps a lullaby carried across generations sung softly before sleep. The melody may have crossed an ocean settling now into this American winter night. Another modest but endearing detail recorded in certain immigrant diaries mentions warming stones wrapped in knitted socks before placing them at children's feet. The socks themselves, hand-knit during long winter evenings, added another layer of insulation, practical and tender at once. The house around you feels layered not only with fabric but with memory. Walls shaped by familiar techniques, bedding woven with inherited skill, heating methods chosen with knowledge forged in distant climates. You drift towards sleep, aware that winter in 19th century America was not faced by one culture alone. It was met by a tapestry of traditions, each contributing small refinements to the art of staying warm. And as the stove glows steadily and thick coverlets hold your heat close, you surrender once more to rest wrapped in wool feather and the quiet endurance of those who carried their winter wisdom across oceans and into the frozen nights of a new land. You turn your attention now to the smallest sleepers in the room. Winter nights always feel sharper when children are present. Their breaths are softer, their bodies smaller, their warmth more easily lost. You imagine yourself kneeling beside a cradle placed near the hearth, careful not to set it too close to stray sparks, yet near enough to borrow some of the fire's gentle heat. The cradle rocks faintly as you nudge it with one hand. Layers of fabric are tucked carefully around the infant within. Linen closest to the skin, then soft wool, then perhaps a quilt folded smaller than those used by adults. You adjust the blanket lightly, ensuring the child's face remains uncovered. Even in the 19th century, experience taught families to keep airways clear. It is widely recognized that infant mortality rates during the 1800s were significantly higher than today, and winter illnesses contributed to that reality. Cold air could aggravate fragile lungs. Respiratory infection spread easily in confined spaces where families clustered for warmth. Parents understood instinctively that maintaining steady heat, however modest, mattered profoundly. You glance toward older children sharing a bed across the room. Their limbs tangle beneath heavy quilts, cheeks flushed with warmth gathered through proximity. In many households, children slept 2 or 3 to a mattress during the coldest months. The arrangement conserved heat and simplified supervision, A restless child was quickly noticed when lying close to siblings. Some researchers have examined whether parents in this era altered bedtime routines during the severe winters, perhaps encouraging earlier sleep to align with longer darkness. Letters and memoirs offer hints that evenings often included quiet storytelling or reading aloud before children were tucked in. Darkness arrived early, and without abundant artificial light there was little reason to resist it. You lift the edge of the cradle's blanket once more and slide a warmed brick wrapped carefully in the cloth near the infant's feet. The brick was heated by the fire and now radiates gentle warmth. This practice appears in numerous household accounts, a small but meaningful gesture to prevent tiny toes from growing too cold. Care was measured in these quiet adjustments. There is a tender anecdote preserved in certain rural diaries describing mothers placing their own shawls over children during unexpected cold snaps, sacrificing personal warmth to ensure little ones remained comfortable. The act speaks volumes without drama. You sit back and listen. The room hums with layered breathing. The fire emits a steady low murmur. Outside, snow drifts along the base of the house. Within these walls, an entire generation rests, dependent on careful management of flame and fabric. Scholars continue to explore how childhood memories of winter shaped later recollections of frontier life. Did those long cold nights feel frightening or comforting? Accounts vary. Some adults remembered the coziness of shared quilts and stories by the hearth. Others recalled persistent drafts and frozen wash basins with less fondness. Memory softens edges over time. You move quietly to the bed of the older children and tuck a loose corner of quilt back into place. One child shifts in size, then settles again. The mattress beneath them is stuffed with straw, perhaps refreshed earlier in the season. Straw retained warmth moderately well, but compressed quickly. Regular fluffing ensured it did not become too thin to insulate properly. Another established observation from that period notes that children often wore simple woolen caps to bed during the harshest cold. Heat escapes readily from the head, and practical families compensated accordingly. You adjust a small cap that has slipped sideways, smoothing it gently back into place. There is a small curiosity recorded in some New England communities where children were told that frost on the window was painted overnight by invisible hands if they slept soundly. The story served as comfort, turning a sign of cold into a quiet marvel. You imagine a child waking to intricate ice patterns and believing in a winter artist at work. The fire dips slightly and you rise to add a small piece of wood. Sparks lift briefly, illuminating the room in a soft golden flash. You watch to ensure the flame catches without flaring too strongly. Too much heat risks dryness and discomfort. Too little invites chill. Balance remains the guiding principle. Researchers continued to debate how much autonomy children had in managing their own comfort during winter nights. Older siblings often helped tend younger ones, reinforcing communal responsibility. In many homes, everyone contributed in small ways to preserving warmth. You return to your place beneath the quilt, aware that the presence of children changes the texture of winter sleep. Vigilance increases, ears remain half attuned to coughs or restless stirring. A sudden drop in temperature prompts quicker action. Yet there is also deep reassurance in the sight of small bodies resting peacefully near the hearth. Their warmth mingles with yours. Their breathing forms a soft chorus that steadies the night. Outside, the world remains frozen and vast. Inside, the cabin feels anchored by the quiet trust of children who assume that morning will come and that the fire will hold. You close your eyes once more, knowing that winter endurance in the 1800s was not solely about logs and quilts. It was about care measured in tucked corners, warmed bricks, and watchful listening through the longest hours of darkness. And as the cradle rocks faintly in the glow of embers, you feel the gentle weight of responsibility that carried families through countless cold nights, one careful adjustment at a time. Even with careful layering, steady embers, and shared warmth, winter carried another quiet presence into the night. Illness. You lie beneath your blankets and listen not only for wind or cracking beams, but for the subtle sounds of coughing in the dark. A dry throat clearing, a muffled sniffle. The cold pressed against lungs as insistently as it pressed against walls. In the 19th century, medical understanding of respiratory disease remained limited. Doctors recognized that cold air aggravated symptoms, but the mechanisms behind infections were not yet fully grasped. It is widely acknowledged that illnesses such as pneumonia, influenza, and tuberculosis claimed many lives during this era, particularly in winter months, when families clustered indoors. Close quarters preserved warmth but also allowed contagion to travel easily from one sleeper to the next. You turn slightly and hear a faint cough from across the room. Instantly, your awareness sharpens. A single cough could mean nothing more than dry air. It could also signal something more serious. You listen for repetition. Silence follows. Keeping indoor air balanced during winter required subtle adjustments. Too much dampness encouraged mold and chill. Too little left throats raw and irritated. Some households placed shallow bowls of water near the fire to add moisture to the air. Others hung damp cloths briefly near the hearth before bedtime. These small measures reflected lived experience rather than formal medical training. There is an interesting detail found in several household guides of the period recommending mustard plasters for chest congestion. The mixture spread onto cloth and placed against the skin produced warmth that was believed to draw illness outward. While modern medicine would question its effectiveness, the intention reveals how warmth of itself was seen as a remedy. Heat equaled healing. You shift beneath the quilt and pull it slightly higher over your shoulder. Your own breath feels steady. In winter, simple discomfort and genuine illness could blur together. Chilled fingers and persistent fatigue were common. Families learned to read signs carefully. A fever rising in the night demanded swift response. Some researchers continue to explore whether winter mortality spikes in the 19th century were primarily due to exposure or to the spread of infectious disease in enclosed spaces. The answer likely involves both. Cabins and boarding houses designed to conserve heat also conserved pathogens, yet without clustering bodies would have frozen. Survival required trade-offs. You think of how mothers or fathers might rise quietly in the night to check a child's forehead feeling for unusual warmth. A candle would be lit briefly shielded from drafts. Shadows would leap along the wall as a worried parent assessed breathing. Nighttime care did not wait for daylight. A small but curious anecdote from certain frontier memoirs describes the use of onion poultices placed near beds to ward off colds. The strong scent was believed to purify air. Whether it offered any medical benefit remains doubtful, but it certainly filled the room with a distinctive aroma. Winter nights were scented with more than smoke and wool. You consider how frostbite lurked at the edges of rural life, for those who ventured outside too long before bed fingers or toes could suffer. Mild cases might pass unnoticed until morning revealed pale, numb patches of skin. Severe cases carried lasting consequences. Protecting extremities with wool socks and gloves was essential even indoors during the coldest spells. Another firmly established historical observation is that many homes lacked consistent indoor plumbing or heated washrooms. Venturing outside to use privies during frigid nights exposed individuals to sudden temperature shocks. Families sometimes kept chamber pots near beds to reduce that risk. It was a practical solution shaped by climate. You listen again for coughing. The room remains quiet except for the gentle crackle of the fire. Relief settles over you. Not every winter night brought illness. Many passed peacefully sustained by careful preparation. Scholars still debate how perceptions of cold itself evolved over time. Did people in the 19th century view winter ailments as inevitable seasonal hardships rather than preventable conditions? Diaries suggest a mixture of resignation and vigilance. Families recognized patterns but lacked modern tools to interrupt them fully. You stretch your legs slightly, feeling the reassuring weight of wool over your feet. Heat remains contained. The cabin holds steady. There is a soft rhythm now to the night. Fire murmurs, breath rises and falls, snow presses gently against the outer walls. Within this layered shelter, health depends on small daily choices. Adequate clothing, proper ventilation, balanced fire tending. You think of herbal teas brewed from dried leaves gathered in summer, offered to soothe winter throats. Mint, chamomile, elderberry. Many households relied on such remedies passed down through generations. Some provided real comfort. Others offered reassurance more than cure. The night stretches onward, but anxiety eases. Illness may have haunted many winters of the past, yet not every cough foretold tragedy. Most nights ended with sunrise and renewed routine. You settled deeper beneath the quilt, aware that winter survival required attention not only to walls and embers, but to bodies themselves. Warmth was medicine, rest was protection, shared vigilance was strength. And as the fire glows gently in the hearth, you close your eyes once more, grateful that tonight the only sound carried through the cabin is the soft, steady breathing of those who have weathered another cold stretch together. The night deepens once more, though this time you do not wake from cold or sound. You wake because the darkness itself feels immense. Winter nights in the 1800s were long in a way that modern life rarely allows. Without electric lights or glowing screens, evening settled heavily, and once candles were extinguished, the world narrowed to firelight and shadow. You lie still beneath your blankets and look toward the hearth. The embers glow faintly, casting a soft amber circle that barely reaches the far wall. Beyond that circle, darkness thickens. It feels textured, almost tangible. It's well documented that before widespread electrification in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, most households relied on candles, oil lamps, or the hearth for light. These sources were precious. Candles required tallow or beeswax. Oil lamps consumed kerosene or whale oil. Both cost money and effort. As a result, families used artificial light sparingly, especially during long winter months when darkness lasted for hours. You recall how earlier in the evening after supper, and quiet conversation lamps were dimmed or extinguished sooner than one might expect today. Sleep arrived not only from fatigue, but from the simple absence of light. Darkness invited rest. Some scholars have explored whether extended winter darkness contributed to different sleep patterns in earlier centuries. Letters and journals occasionally describe segmented sleep, with individuals waking briefly in the middle of the night for reflection or prayer before returning to bed. Others suggest that exhaustion from daily labour often overruled any such pattern. The evidence remains varied, shaped by region and circumstance. You shift slightly and notice how your eyes adjust to the low glow. Shapes emerge gradually. The outline of a chair, the curve of a cradle, the beam overhead. Light is not absent, only subdued. There is a curious detail recorded in some rural households where families deliberately positioned mirrors to reflect firelight deeper into rooms during winter evenings. The effect was modest but meaningful. A single flame could illuminate more space with thoughtful placement. You think of evenings spent reading aloud by lamplight before surrendering to darkness. Books were treasured possessions. A single volume might serve an entire household for years. In winter, when outdoor labour slowed, reading and storytelling filled hours that summer never permitted. The quiet intimacy of those moments lingered long after the lamp was blown out. Outside, the snow reflects faint starlight, amplifying the night sky's presence. On clear winter evenings, the stars can appear startlingly bright against cold air. In rural areas, free from artificial glow, constellations stretched boldly across the sky. Many families stepped outside briefly before bed to gauge weather, or simply breathe crisp air. The contrast between indoor warmth and outdoor vastness sharpened the senses. Another established observation from the period is that some communities used church bells or town clocks to mark time through winter darkness. In urban settings, the tolling of a bell might drift faintly through snow-laden air, reminding listeners of passing hours. In rural regions, time was measured more by habit than by sound. You draw the quilt closer and let your thoughts drift. Darkness, once feared, becomes a companion. It slows the mind. Without bright light to stimulate, your thoughts lengthen and soften. There is a charming anecdote from certain New England towns where children were told that the longer winter nights gave the earth time to rest beneath its blanket of snow. The story mirrored reality in an almost scientific way. Fields lay dormant, conserving strength for spring. In a similar fashion, you lie still, conserving your own energy. Researchers continued to discuss how the absence of artificial light influenced mental rhythms in the 19th century. Some suggest that earlier bedtimes and longer periods of darkness fostered deeper reflection. Others note that limited light could also intensify feelings of isolation during harsh winters. As with so much of the past, experiences varied widely. The fire emits a small, soft crackle, then settles again. Its glow pulses gently steady but subdued. You feel secure in its presence even as it dims. You consider how profoundly winter shaped the boundaries of daily life. Activities that required light were compressed into shorter windows. Night invited stillness. Sleep became both necessity and escape from cold. The room around you feels enclosed, protective. Beyond its walls, snow covers roads and fields, muffling sound and movement. Inside, darkness wraps around quilts and timber alike. You close your eyes once more, allowing the absence of light to guide you deeper into rest. There is no urgency here. No buzzing lamp, no flickering screen. Only the soft glow of embers and the steady rhythm of breath. In the coldest winters of 19th century America, darkness was not merely the absence of sun. It was an environment in itself, shaping routines, thoughts, and the very structure of sleep. And as the fire fades toward its quietest hour, you surrender to that darkness, fully trusting that dawn will return in its own time, as it always has, carrying light back across snow-covered land. Morning returns again in your imagination, and with it the memory that winter sleep did not exist in isolation from the rest of the homestead. The barn stands only a short distance from the house, its roof heavy with snow. You pull on boots warmed near the hearth and step outside into air that feels sharp and clean. The cold bites more fiercely beyond the cabin walls. Snow crunches beneath your feet in a rhythm that echoes across the yard. Your breath rises in thick clouds. Yet you move with purpose because the warmth of the night depended partly on what waited inside that barn. It's widely recognised that in many 19th century farmsteads, barns were positioned close to the house not only for convenience but also to provide partial shelter from prevailing winds. Structures placed strategically could reduce the force of winter gusts striking the main dwelling. Architecture extended beyond walls. The entire layout of a farm was part of its defence against cold. You open the barn door and step into a different kind of warmth. It is not the bright heat of a stove or hearth, but a gentler living warmth generated by animals. Horses shift in their stalls, cows exhale slowly their breath, forming soft clouds in the dim interior. The scent of hay and livestock fills the air earthy and strong. Animals produce significant body heat. In tightly enclosed barns, that warmth could raise interior temperatures noticeably compared to the outside air. Some farm families even built small sleeping lofts above barn areas during extreme cold, taking advantage of rising heat. Whether widespread or occasional remains a topic of discussion among historians, but the principle is clear. Livestock were not only economic assets, they were sources of thermal comfort. You run a hand along a horse's flank, feeling steady warmth beneath thick winter coat. The animal turns its head slightly, acknowledging your presence. There is reassurance in this shared endurance. You check water troughs, breaking thin layers of ice with a practiced motion. Animals must be cared for before you can return fully to the house. Their survival intertwines with yours. There is an interesting anecdote from certain Midwestern farms where families kept small flocks of chickens in attached sheds during the harshest nights to prevent freezing. The birds' body heat, though modest, individually accumulated within confined spaces. Winter encouraged creative use of every living source of warmth. After tending to livestock, you step back outside. The sky glows pale blue above snowfields. The cabin's chimney releases a thin, steady ribbon of smoke. Inside, the fire continues its work. You enter the house and stamp snow from your boots. The contrast between barn warmth and hearth warmth lingers in your senses. Both are necessary. Both contribute to the rhythm of the winter survival. Scholars continue to examine how proximity between humans and animals influenced health during this era. While barns provided warmth, close quarters also posed risks of disease transmission. Balancing benefit and hazard was a constant calculation. Yet necessity often outweighed caution. You move back towards the hearth and extend your hands to the fire once more. The room feels warmer now than before you stepped out, perhaps because your skin still carries memory of the barn's gentler heat. In some rural communities, families arranged their homesteads so that the barn shielded the house from the north wind, while woodpiles stacked strategically along exposed sides added another barrier. Snow drifting against these structures formed a natural insulation. The entire property became a layered system designed to endure winter. You glance toward the bed where quilts remain rumpled from sleep. Night feels distant, already replaced by chores and movement. Yet the memory of shared warmth beneath wool remains vivid. Another well-documented aspect of farm life during this period is that winter reduced certain types of labour, but intensified others. Fields lay dormant, but livestock demanded daily care regardless of temperature. Sleep offered recovery from physical exertion that did not pause for frost. There is a small but charming detail from some agricultural diaries noting that cats often slept near cows in barns during winter nights, benefiting from the animals' warmth while keeping rodents at bay. Even small creatures adapted creatively. You pour water into a kettle and set it above the flames. Soon steam rises gently. The room fills with the comforting scent of heated iron and wood smoke. Outside, snow continues to gleam under growing sunlight. Researchers still explore how rural architecture evolved in response to winter climate. The integration of house, barn, and storage structures reflected an understanding that warmth extended beyond individual rooms. The farm itself functioned as a protective organism. You sit for a moment on a wooden chair near the hearth, boots drying slowly. The night's cold feels less threatening now, replaced by the steady routine of morning. Yet you know that when evening returns, the same careful preparations will begin again. Sleep during the coldest winters of 19th century America was never detached from daily labour. It was woven into the cycle of tending animals, stacking wood, clearing snow, and preserving fuel. Each night's rest depended on each day's work. And as you watch the fire burn steadily while barn animals settle into their own winter rhythm outside, you sense how deeply interconnected warmth, labour, and rest truly were in a world where survival hinged on quiet cooperation between people, animals, and carefully built shelter. Not every winter night unfolded gently into quiet snowfall and a manageable cold. Some arrived with a violence that rewrote memory. You imagine yourself lying beneath thick quilts when, without warning, the wind rises in a furious rush. The cabin trembles, Snow lashes the walls like thrown sand. The familiar rhythm of winter transforms into something urgent. You sit upright, heart quickened, listening. The storm's intensity feels different from the steady gusts you have grown accustomed to. This is a blizzard gathering strength. One of the most infamous examples in American history occurred in January of 1888, when a sudden blizzard swept across the Great Plains with little warning. Often referred to as the schoolhouse blizzard, it caught many children and teachers travelling home at the end of the day. Temperatures plunged rapidly and visibility vanished in swirling snow. The event remains a stark reminder of how swiftly winter conditions could turn deadly in the 19th century. You picture a family inside a small prairie house as such a storm strikes. The first instinct is to secure the structure. Doors are checked, shutters fastened, extra cloth pressed into cracks. The fire is fed carefully, not wildly conserving fuel while maintaining heat. Panic wastes energy. Winter rewards steadiness. The sound of wind becomes almost deafening, pressing against every seam. Snow begins to pile high along the windward side of the cabin. Drifts rise quickly, sometimes reaching windowsills within hours. The world beyond the walls disappears into white. You pull the quilt closer and feel the shared warmth beside you. In such moments, proximity offers reassurance as much as heat. The house may creak and groan, but inside breath remains steady. There is an intriguing account from certain frontier families who described placing extra bedding against doors during blizzards to reduce drafts and noise. Quilts doubled as insulation barriers. The home was transformed temporarily into a padded refuge layered thick against assault. Scholars continue to examine how communities responded collectively to severe winter storms in this era. In towns connected by telegraph or rail warnings, occasionally spread though not always in time. In remote homesteads, individuals relied solely on sky wind and experience to gauge danger. Historians still debate how much improved communication networks by the late 19th century reduced winter mortality compared to earlier decades. You imagine rising from bed to check the roofline for leaks or shifting snow. Each movement into colder air feels risky. Yet vigilance is necessary. If snow blocks the chimney entirely, smoke could back into the room. If drifts seal the door completely, morning exit becomes more difficult. Inside the cabin, the fire becomes a focal point. Flames must not die, nor must they flare uncontrollably. The line between warmth and hazard narrows during intense storms. Sparks could ignite nearby fabric at the worst possible moment. A lesser-known anecdote from some Great Plains settlers describes tying ropes between house and barn before storms intensified. These lines acted as guides if someone needed to move between structures in near-zero visibility. The rope might be grasped tightly while wind roared, ensuring that even a few yards could be navigated safely. Preparation extended beyond walls to the spaces between them. You settle back beneath blankets, listening to the storm's peak. It sounds almost alive, shifting pitch and rhythm. At times it screams, at others it moans low and steady. Snow strikes the roof, then slides away in heavy sheets. There is a psychological dimension to such nights. Isolation deepens when visibility drops to nothing. You cannot see neighbouring homes, you cannot judge distance. The world contracts to the space illuminated by your hearth. Researchers continue to explore how repeated exposure to severe storms influence the mental resilience of frontier families. Some accounts describe a calm acceptance born of experience. Others reveal lingering anxiety long after wind subsided. You think of children lying awake during such a storm, listening wide-eyed to the violence outside. Parents might speak softly, offering reassurance that the walls were strong, that the fire would hold. Words become part of insulation, cushioning fear. Eventually, even the fiercest blizzard must expend itself. Wind loses momentum. Snow falls more gently. The sound softens from roar to whisper. You imagine waking the next morning to a transformed landscape, drifts sculpted into towering shapes, fence posts tearly buried, the path to the barn erased. Clearing snow becomes the first labour of the day. Another firmly documented observation from prairie life notes that after extreme storms, communities sometimes organise cooperative efforts to dig out neighbours whose homes were nearly sealed by drifts. Winter demanded mutual aid as much as individual endurance. As the imagined storm subsides, you feel the quilt's warmth steady around you. The cabin, though tested, has held. The fire, carefully managed, continues to glow. Blizzards etched themselves into memory because they revealed both vulnerability and resilience. In the coldest winters of 19th century America, sleep sometimes occurred in the eye of fury. Yet through preparation, shared warmth, and patient tending of flame, families endured even the harshest nights. and as calm returns and snow settles softly against the walls, you sink once more into rest, aware that survival here was not about eliminating winter's power, but about meeting it with steady hands and unbroken will. As the century moves forward in your mind, something subtle begins to change in the way winter nights feel. You still sense the cold pressing against walls, still hear wind along the roofline, yet there is a new undercurrent of modernity threading through the darkness. The railroad whistle echoes faintly across a growing town, and with it arrives coal iron and manufactured comfort. You stand now inside a modest house in a railroad town somewhere in the Midwest. Outside, tracks cut across snow-covered fields, carrying freight and passengers through landscapes that once felt unreachable in winter. Inside, a cast-iron stove sits at the centre of the main room, larger and more refined than earlier models. Its surface gleams faintly in the firelight. By the latter half of the 19th century, expanding rail networks transformed access to fuel. Coal from Pennsylvania and other mining regions travelled efficiently across states, reaching towns that previously depended solely on local wood supplies. This shift had profound effects on winter heating. Coal burned longer and hotter than many types of firewood, allowing households to maintain steadier temperatures overnight. You kneel before the stove and adjust the damper slightly. The control feels deliberate, almost scientific. Instead of relying entirely on intuition and ash banking, you can regulate airflow with a small turn of a metal. The fire responds predictably. Heat radiates outward in a consistent circle. You return to bed and notice that the room cools more slowly now. The mattress retains warmth longer. The chill at the edges of blankets is less sharp. It is not luxury, but it is progress. There is a fascinating note from certain late 19th century catalogues advertising heating stoves as symbols of advancement and domestic pride. Manufacturers promised improved efficiency and reduced fuel consumption. The language framed warmth not merely as survival, but as refinement. Winter sleep was becoming something to optimize rather than simply endure. Historians continue to examine how these technological changes influenced expectations of comfort. Did families who acquired modern stoves become less tolerant of cold drafts and fluctuating temperatures? Or did older habits of thrift and resilience persist despite new tools? Evidence suggests a gradual shift rather than an abrupt transformation. You pull the blanket higher and feel how evenly the warmth spreads through the room. The air near the floor is no longer as biting as in earlier cabins. Coal's steady burn reduces the need to rise repeatedly in the night to tend embers. Sleep can stretch longer, less interrupted by vigilance. There is an intriguing anecdote from some railroad towns where children describe the comforting rumble of distant trains during winter nights. The sound signaled connection to a broader world even when snow lay deep outside. Industrial expansion brought not only goods, but a sense of movement through seasons that once felt isolating. You think about how urban neighbourhoods also changed. Brick row houses built close together shared walls that retained heat more effectively than standalone wooden cabins. Collective architecture created thermal benefits. One household's fire warmed the adjacent wall of another. Density became an ally against cold. Another well-established detail from this period is the gradual introduction of double-paned windows in wealthier homes designed to reduce heat loss. Though not widespread at first, such innovations hinted at a future where insulation would become a science. For now, heavy curtains and shutters still perform much of the work. You close your eyes and listen to the stove's low, steady hum. It lacks the lively crackle of an open hearth, yet its consistency is soothing. The predictability of heat fosters deeper rest. Scholars still debate how rapidly these improvements reached rural populations compared to towns and cities. Economic disparity meant that some families continued relying on traditional fireplaces well into the late 19th century. Progress moved unevenly shaped by access and income. You shift slightly and notice how little the room temperature has changed since you lay down. The need to plug drafts or add extra cloth along walls feels less urgent. Architecture, fuel and technology now collaborate more effectively. There is a small but telling curiosity from advertisements of the era claiming that certain stoves were so efficient they could keep a room warm all night with minimal fuel. Whether those claims always held true is uncertain, yet the promise itself reveals evolving aspirations. Winter comfort was becoming an attainable goal rather than a daily negotiation. Outside, snow continues to fall softly along the railroad tracks. The world remains cold, but inside this home, heat is steadier, more controlled. You sense the beginning of a shift that will in time reshape winter sleep entirely. For now, you remain beneath wool blankets and perhaps a feather mattress still dependent on layers and shared warmth. Yet the steady glow of coal beneath iron signals a new chapter. The coldest winters of 19th century America are slowly being met not only with endurance, but with innovation. and as you drift into sleep beside the quiet ticking stove, you feel the subtle easing of winter's grip, not because the season has softened, but because human ingenuity has begun to reshape the night itself. Now your thoughts climb higher away from towns and rail lines into the mountains where winter feels sharper and more solitary. You imagine a small trapping cabin perched along a ridge, snow piled deep against its rough-hewn walls. Pine trees stand heavy with frost, their branches bowing under white weight. The air here is thinner, colder, more unforgiving. You push open the cabin door and step into a single room lit by the glow of a modest hearth. This is not a family dwelling, but a temporary shelter used by trappers and hunters who remain in remote regions through winter months. The space is spare. A narrow bed built from planks, a table, a stack of furs folded neatly in one corner. In the 19th century, fur trappers and mountain men often overwintered in isolated cabins across the Rockies and other highland regions. Historical accounts from the fur trade era describe winters spent far from settlements with only essential supplies and whatever game could be secured. Survival in such environments demanded careful planning and intimate knowledge of the landscape. You approach the bed and run your hand across the thick animal pelts laid atop it. Beaver elk, perhaps buffalo hide if available. These furs provide insulation far superior to simple cloth alone. Their dense fibers trap heat efficiently, creating a barrier between your body and the biting mountain air. You sit and remove heavy outer garments crusted faintly with snow. The fire here burns steadily but modestly. Wood at high elevations may be abundant in some regions, yet difficult to gather under deep drifts. Every log must be chosen carefully. Fuel is life. There is a striking detail recorded in several mountain journals describing how trappers often slept wrapped directly in furs, rather than beneath woven blankets. The pelts retained warmth even when temperatures plunged far below zero. Combined with wool clothing worn to bed, they formed a layered defense against extreme cold. You lie back and pull a heavy fur over your shoulders. It feels different from wool, denser, almost weighty. The scent of animal hide lingers earthy and faintly wild. The mattress beneath may be stuffed with pine boughs, their needles providing both cushioning and a subtle aromatic quality. Researchers continue to examine how overwintering trappers manage psychological isolation in such remote settings. Letters and memoirs suggest that while some found solitude peaceful, others struggled with long stretches of silence broken only by wind and crackling fire. Sleep in these cabins was both refuge and escape from relentless exposure. Outside, the mountain wind sweeps along ridgelines, carrying snow in fine crystalline sheets. The cabin walls creak softly. In high elevations, temperatures can drop sharply after sunset, far colder than in valleys below. You curl deeper into the furs and feel warmth accumulate slowly. Without shared body heat, insulation must work harder. Trappers often slept alone, relying on layers of clothing and pelts rather than proximity. Some accounts mention sleeping with boots nearby and clothing partially on to allow quick response if the animals approached or weather shifted suddenly. Vigilance never fully relaxed. There is an unusual anecdote from certain Rocky Mountain camps where trappers reportedly placed heated stones wrapped in cloth inside their bedrolls before settling in. The practice mirrored frontier household habits adapted for wilderness life. Even in isolation, small rituals of warmth persisted. You listen to the mountain night. Unlike prairie storms that roar across open land, alpine winds weave through trees, producing a low haunting sound. Snow may slide from branches with a soft rush. Occasionally distant animal calls echo faintly amplified by cold air. A firmly established fact of the fur trade era is that winter trapping required careful timing and preparation. Animals' pelts were thickest during cold months, making this season economically important despite its risks. Sleep came after long days checking traps, hauling supplies, and navigating deep snow. Exhaustion often outweighed discomfort. Scholars still debate how accurately romanticized images of mountain men reflect daily realities. Popular stories depict rugged independence, yet journals reveal constant labor and careful resource management. Winter nights were not carefree adventures, but calculated pauses between demanding days. You shift slightly and feel the warmth concentrated closest to your core. The outer edges of the fur remain cool to the touch. You draw it tighter, sealing the small pocket of heat around you. There is no quilted patchwork here, no cradle rocking near the hearth. Instead, there is the steady companionship of flame and the quiet resilience of thick hide. The simplicity of the space sharpens your awareness of every sound and temperature change. As the fire burns lower, you consider whether to add another log or conserve fuel for morning. Decisions carry weight in isolation. There is no neighbour nearby to borrow from if supplies run short. Eventually, fatigue settles in fully. Your body relaxes into the layered furs, drawing warmth inward. Outside mountains stand silent beneath starlight and snow. Inside the cabin holds its modest heat against vast cold. And as you drift into sleep high above valleys and distant towns, you understand that even in the most remote corners of 19th century America, winter rest followed the same essential principles. Shelter built carefully, fire tended wisely, insulation layered with intention. In the mountains, as on the plains, sleep was earned through preparation, and every dawn marked another small triumph over the relentless chill. From the mountains, your thoughts travel farther north and west toward communities whose knowledge of winter long predates the 19th century. You imagine stepping quietly into a snow-covered clearing where a different kind of shelter stands beneath the pale glow of moonlight. This is not a log cabin or sod house, but a structure shaped by indigenous wisdom, refined over generations of intimate familiarity with cold landscapes. You approach a winter dwelling constructed with deliberate care. In forested regions, it may be a bark-covered longhouse reinforced for the season, its frame strong and its walls layered thick. In Arctic or sub-Arctic environments, you might encounter a snowhouse carefully cut block stacked into a dome that traps heat efficiently within its curved walls. It's well established that many Native American communities across northern regions developed highly sophisticated winter housing suited precisely to their environments. The snowhouse, often associated with Inuit populations, functioned as an effective insulator because compacted snow contains trapped air that slows heat loss. Inside, body heat and small lamps fueled by animal fat could raise temperatures significantly above those outside. You step inside such a dwelling in your imagination. The air feels surprisingly calm compared to the biting wind beyond. The curved walls diffuse sound. Light from a small flame flickers softly against white surfaces, creating a gentle glow rather than harsh shadow. You sit on a raised sleeping platform layered with animal skins. Beneath you, insulation separates your body from frozen ground. Above the dome retains warmth, allowing heat to circulate rather than escape straight upward. The design reflects centuries of adaptation rather than hurried necessity. There is a compelling detail found in accounts from early European explorers who were astonished by how warm these structures could feel despite extreme external temperatures. What appeared fragile from a distance proved remarkably effective. Form followed environment. Scholars continue to examine how indigenous winter architecture influenced later settler practices, particularly in regions where survival depended on learning from those already familiar with harsh climates. Historians still argue whether settlers fully appreciated or adequately adopted these methods, though evidence suggests some exchange of knowledge occurred in frontier zones. You wrap a fur more tightly around your shoulders and notice how the interior feels balanced, neither overly dry nor excessively damp. The design allows subtle ventilation through small openings while preserving warmth. In woodland regions, farther south, winter longhouses offered communal shelter. Multiple families might sleep within a single extended structure with fires spaced along its length. The shared warmth of many bodies combined with controlled flame created a stable environment during cold months. There is a fascinating anecdote recorded in some northern traditions describing the placement of sleeping areas slightly elevated from the floor to avoid cold air pooling below. The principle mirrors practices seen in settler cabins, yet here it evolved independently through observation and experience. You listen to the muffled quiet inside the snow-walled shelter. Outside, wind sweeps across open land, but within sound is softened. The space feels enclosed in a protective embrace shaped directly from winter itself. Another firmly documented fact is that animal skins were often used strategically with fur turned inward for warmth during sleep. The insulating quality of fur surpasses many woven fabrics, especially in extreme cold. Combined with layered clothing, it provided reliable defense against frigid air. Researchers still explore how indigenous communities balance mobility and winter shelter design. Some groups constructed seasonal dwellings that could be assembled and disassembled efficiently, while others built more permanent winter villages. Adaptation was never static. It responded to environment resources and cultural practice. You lie back against the layered skins and feel warmth gather steadily. The curved ceiling above you diffuses the flicker of flame, creating a soothing rhythm of light. Unlike wooden cabins that creak sharply in cold, this structure remains quiet, its compacted snow firm and stable. There is a subtle scent in the air from the oil lamp, faintly sweet and smoky. The flame is small but sufficient. The dome shape captures rising heat and reflects it downward. You think about how winter knowledge developed over generations in these communities long before settlers arrived. Techniques refined through trial and adaptation offered survival not as improvisation, but as inheritance. Scholars continue to discuss the degree to which later American winter practices owe debt to indigenous expertise. While some methods were adopted directly, others remain distinct. What remains undeniable is the sophistication of these designs in meeting cold climates with precision. You close your eyes and feel the steady warmth held within snow walls. The contrast between outside and inside is profound. What appears as frozen landscape from afar becomes, when shaped carefully, a protective shell. As you drift towards sleep within this imagined shelter, you recognize that winter survival in 19th century America encompassed far more than one architectural tradition. It included knowledge carried for centuries across tundra, forest and plain. And within this quiet dome of snow and skin, warmed by careful flame and shared breath, you surrender once more to rest, sheltered not only by material but by wisdom deeply rooted in the rhythms of winter itself. You return now to the familiar wooden cabin, yet something about this night feels experimental. Winter has stretched on for weeks. Fuel supplies are carefully measured. Every family develops small innovations to stretch warmth a little further. You kneel by the hearth not out of urgency but out of curiosity. What else might hold the cold at bay? The fire burns modestly, and beside it rests a collection of objects that reveal quiet ingenuity. A flat iron warming on a stone, a brick placed close enough to absorb heat without cracking, a metal pan with a long handle leaning against the wall. It is a firmly established detail that warming pans were common household items in earlier centuries and continued in use in parts of 19th century America. These shallow metal pans filled with hot embers and slid between sheets drove away the initial chill before sleep. The practice reduced the shock of lying on cold linen and accelerated the body's ability to trap heat beneath blankets. You lift the pan carefully, ensuring embers remain contained, and carry it toward the bed. The faint scent of heated metal mingles with smoke. You slide the pan between layers and move it slowly across the mattress surface. The fabric warms gently beneath your hand. It feels almost indulgent, though it is purely practical. There is a small but delightful detail recorded in some rural memoirs describing children waiting impatiently for the warming pan to finish its slow circuit, eager to dive into a bed that felt welcoming rather than icy. Even in austere winters, small comforts mattered deeply. You return the pan to the hearth and consider the heated brick. Wrapped in cloth, it will retain warmth for an hour or more. You tuck it near the foot of the bed, imagining how it will cradle cold toes once you lie down. Researchers continue to examine how domestic creativity flourished in frontier settings, where manufactured goods were scarce. Households adapted everyday objects for multiple purposes. A simple iron used for pressing clothes might double as a heat source at night. Resourcefulness became second nature. You glance toward a small kettle suspended above the fire. Steam curls gently upward. Some families believed that placing additional water near the hearth during especially cold spells improved comfort by preventing the air from becoming too dry. Whether fully understood or not, the practice reflected close observation of bodily response to environment. Another well-documented observation from household manuals of the era recommends shaking and turning mattresses regularly during winter to redistribute filling and maintain loft. Compressed straw or feathers lost insulating capacity over time. Even bedding required maintenance to perform effectively. You move to the bed and lift the corner of the mattress slightly, giving it a small shake. The stuffing shifts audibly within its ticking. A faint rustle accompanies the motion. The simple act renews its ability to trap air beneath you. There is an unusual anecdote from certain northern settlements describing the use of hot potatoes placed in cloth at the foot of the beds during extreme cold. The potatoes heated in the hearth provided gentle warmth and could be eaten in the morning if not fully consumed by heat. Food and comfort intertwined in practical ways. Scholars still debate how widespread such inventive techniques truly were, as written records often emphasize more formal methods of heating. Yet oral histories suggest that many households improvise quietly, guided by necessity rather than instruction manuals. You lie down and feel the mattress beneath you warmer than on previous nights. The heated pan has done its work. The brick at your feet radiates softly through layers of cloth. The quilt rests heavier tonight, perhaps layered with an additional blanket. Outside wind brushes lightly against the walls, but it lacks the force of earlier storms. The snow that has accumulated over days now acts as a secondary barrier. You think about how each winter likely brought new refinements. A draft discovered one year might be sealed more effectively the next. A particularly cold spell might inspire the acquisition of thicker wool or a better stove. Knowledge accumulated gradually season by season. Another established fact is that by the late 19th century, printed household guides circulated widely offering advice on efficient heating, insulation, and even sleep hygiene. Though not universally accessible, such publications signalled a growing cultural focus on domestic science. Comfort was becoming a subject of study rather than mere endurance. You draw the quilt up and slide your feet toward the warm brick. The sensation is immediate and reassuring. Heat spreads slowly upward from your toes, easing the chill that often lingers there longest. The fire crackles gently, its light reflecting off the warming pan's metal surface door. Shadows shift softly across the ceiling. The cabin feels less like a battlefield against winter and more like a workshop of small solutions. You close your eyes and recognize that sleep in the coldest winters of 19th century America was never passive. It was supported by quiet experiments conducted in kitchens and bedrooms alike. Heated stones, warming pans, extra quilts hung along walls. Each innovation may seem minor in isolation, yet together they form a tapestry of ingenuity woven through countless nights. And as warmth settles around you in carefully layered increments, you drift toward rest. Sustained not only by fire and fabric, but by the steady creativity that turned harsh winters into survivable seasons. You lie still for a moment, aware of the warmth building beneath your quilts, and yet another thought threads quietly into your mind. Fire is comfort. Fire is survival. But fire is also danger. Every log you place upon the hearth carries not only heat, but risk. You open your eyes and look toward the flames. They flicker gently now, contained within stone or brick. Yet in a house built largely of wood with floors of timber and bedding stuffed with dry straw or feathers, caution is never far from awareness. It is a sobering historical reality that house fires were a common hazard in 19th century America. Open hearths, candles, oil lamps, and early stoves all posed risks, especially during long winter nights when flames burned for hours on end. Entire towns occasionally suffered devastating fires that began from a single stray spark or an overturned lamp. Winter did not reduce this danger. In some ways, it intensified it. You rise quietly from the bed and move closer to the hearth. The fire burns steadily, but you check the placement of each log, ensuring none extend too far outward. Sparks occasionally lift and drift upward into the chimney throat. The stone surround feels reassuringly solid. In many homes of the era, families placed a metal screen in the front of the fireplace to reduce the chance of embers escaping. Not every household possessed such equipment, especially in remote areas, but where available, it provided a modest safeguard. You recall that earlier you warmed a brick and used a metal pan between the sheets. Even these tools carried small risks if mishandled. Embers dropped from a warming pan could smoulder unnoticed. A brick heated too long might scorch cloth. Comfort demanded attentiveness. There is a small yet telling detail recorded in certain rural accounts where parents instructed children never to approach the hearth unattended during winter evenings. Lessons about fire safety were woven into daily life from an early age. A single careless moment could undo an entire season's preparation. Scholars continue to examine how advances in stove design during the 19th century gradually reduced the frequency of accidental fires. Enclosed iron stoves contained flames more effectively than open hearths. Adjustable dampers allowed greater control. Yet early models were not without flaws. Poorly maintained flues or overheated pipes could ignite nearby walls. You crouch and adjust the damper, slightly reducing airflow to calm the flames. The fire responds by lowering into a steadier glow. It is a delicate balance. Too little oxygen and heat fades quickly. Too much and the blaze grows aggressive. Another well-documented observation from the period is that many households kept buckets of sand or water near the hearth as a precaution. In the event of sparks landing on the floor or rug, immediate response was essential. Winter sleep was accompanied by quiet readiness. You return to the bed and lie down once more, but your gaze lingers on the fire. It is mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. Its light dances across the ceiling beams. Shadows sway gently along the walls. The same flame that warms your bones could consume this entire room if neglected. There is an unusual anecdote from some frontier memoirs describing families who lost homes to winter fires caused by overloaded chimneys clogged with soot. Regular cleaning was necessary, yet access to tools and safe conditions varied. Chimney maintenance became another seasonal task added to the long list of winter preparations. You draw the quilt higher around your shoulders and remind yourself that vigilance does not mean fear. Fire has been companion to humanity for millennia. Respect not panic, sustain safety. Outside snow rests thickly against the cabin walls, muffling sound. Ironically, that snow could also slow the spread of flames should the worst occur. Winter, in its paradoxical way, both increased reliance on fire and offered slight protection against its spread. Researchers still explore how communities organised mutual aid in the event of fires during cold months. In towns, neighbours often formed bucket brigades to extinguish flames before they leapt from building to building. In isolated areas, families relied solely on themselves. The stakes were high. Rebuilding in winter conditions was no small task. You feel the warmth of the hearth steady once more, controlled and contained. The logs settle with a soft crack. The fire's intensity lowers to a calm glow suitable for the remainder of the night. There is a quiet reassurance in knowing that countless families navigated this balance night after night. They slept within reach of flame-trusting stone and brick to hold. They rose to adjust dampers and reposition logs. They taught children caution as carefully as they taught them warmth. You close your eyes, the flicker of light still visible faintly through your lids. The fire is no longer a roaring presence, but a steady guardian. In the coldest winters of 19th century America, sleep was warmed by flame, yet shadowed by its potential. Comfort and caution lived side by side, and as you drift toward rest, listening to the subdued murmur of controlled fire, you understand that enduring winter required not only ingenuity and preparation, but a constant quiet respect for the very element that made sleep possible. After so many nights of careful tending and measured vigilance, you begin to notice something quieter than wind or flame. It is the way winter settles into the mind. The days are shorter, the fields lie dormant, roads remain snow-covered for weeks. Even when the fire burns steadily and quilts are thick, there is a stillness that seeps inward. You sit near the hearth in the early evening, watching the light fade from the window more quickly than it did in autumn. Darkness arrives before you are quite ready. In the 1800s, this seasonal contraction of daylight shaped daily rhythm profoundly. Without abundant artificial light, activity narrowed to what could be done within reach of flame or lamp. It's a commonly accepted observation that winter months in rural 19th century communities often fostered periods of enforced closeness. Families spent extended time indoors sharing confined space. This proximity could deepen bonds, yet it could also strain patience. Cabin fever was not merely a modern phrase. Diaries from the period occasionally hint at restlessness during prolonged storms. You glance around the room. The same walls that protect you can feel small after weeks of snow. The same routines repeated nightly may grow familiar to the point of monotony. Yet those routines also create stability. Banking the fire, shaking the mattress, plugging drafts. The repetition anchors you against unpredictability outside. Researchers continue to examine how seasonal isolation influenced emotional well-being in earlier centuries. Some suggest that communities developed rich winter traditions to counteract the weight of darkness. Quilting bees, storytelling circles, shared music, and quiet reading by lamplight filled long evenings. Historians still argue whether these gatherings were primarily practical or deeply therapeutic. Perhaps they were both. You pull your chair slightly closer to the hearth and feel warmth spread along your shins. The fire's glow softens the edges of shadow. Across the room, someone hums a tune barely above a whisper. Music in winter often carries a subdued quality, as if matching the hush of snow outside. There is an intriguing anecdote from certain frontier settlements describing neighbours visiting one another on clear winter nights carrying lanterns through snow to exchange news and companionship. The journey required effort, but the reward was shared laughter and stories that broke monotony. You think about how sleep becomes not only physical restoration, but emotional refuge during such seasons. Beneath quilts in darkness, warmed by embers, the mind can wander beyond confined walls. Dreams carry you across thawed fields and green hills, even while snowy piles high outside. Another firmly documented aspect of a 19th century winter life is the reliance on letter writing to maintain connection with distant family. Long evenings provided time to compose careful messages by lamplight. These letters often described weather health and household preparations, preserving a record of seasonal endurance. You rise and place another log onto the hearth. The flame brightens briefly, casting a lively glow across the room. Sparks lift and vanish into the chimney. The simple act of tending fire interrupts quiet introspection, grounding you once more in practical necessity. Scholars continue to debate how much seasonal mood variation existed before the advent of electric lighting and modern work schedules. Did earlier generations experience winter melancholy differently, perhaps more attuned to natural cycles? Evidence remains scattered, drawn from diaries and memoirs rather than clinical study. You return to your seat and wrap a shawl around your shoulders. The wool feels reassuring, textured and warm. Outside, the world is still. Snow absorbs sound, creating a cocoon not only around the house, but around the entire landscape. Within this hush, you sense both confinement and comfort. Winter demands patience, it slows ambition. It narrows focus to immediate needs. There is a small but tender detail found in some personal accounts describing families gathering near the hearth simply to sit in companionable silence during cold nights. No grand entertainment, no elaborate conversation, just shared presence beneath flickering light. In a world without constant distraction, stillness held its own quiet value. You prepare for bed once more, repeating motions that have grown familiar. The mattress is fluffed, the quilt is straightened. The brick warmed earlier is wrapped carefully in cloth. Each step is known by heart. As you slip beneath the covers, you feel the weight of winter not only in temperature but in time. Days pass slowly, nights stretch long, yet within that length lies a rhythm that has carried countless generations. Sleep in this context becomes a gentle surrender to the season rather than a retreat from it. Beneath layered fabric and steady flame, you allow your mind to soften, trusting that even the longest winter yields eventually to change. And as darkness gathers once more around the cabin, you rest within it, sustained by routine companionship and the quiet resilience that turns isolation into reflection rather than despair. You wake before dawn again, not to the roar of wind or the crack of shifting beams, but to a stillness so complete it feels almost suspended. The coldest part of the night has passed, yet the air remains sharp. The embers in the hearth glow faintly steadied but subdued, waiting for your attention. You lie still for a moment, noticing how your body feels. Stiffness lingers in your joints. Your shoulders carry the memory of yesterday's labour. Winter sleep restores, yet it does not erase effort entirely. Muscles that hauled wood and cleared snow remind you quietly that another day awaits. It is well documented that manual labour defined much of daily life in 19th century America, especially in rural settings. Chopping wood, hauling water, tending livestock, mending fences buried in drifts. Sleep provided necessary recovery, yet mornings often began with lingering aches that gradually eased once movement resumed. You slide from beneath the quilt and stand carefully testing your footing on cold floorboards. The room feels colder than when you fell asleep, but not brutally so. The preparation you carried out the night before has held. The draft you plugged remains sealed. The snow against the walls insulates quietly. You kneel by the hearth and break apart the ash once more. A bright pulse of orange emerges from beneath grey powder. Relief spreads through you. The fire has survived the night without faltering. You feed it gently with kindling, blowing softly until flame curls upward. There is a small but revealing detail preserved in some household diaries describing how individuals judged the success of a winter night by the state of the hearth at dawn. If coals remained alive, the night was considered well managed. If not, it signalled either poor banking or an unusually severe drop in temperature. The hearth became a silent measure of competence. You rise and stretch, slowly feeling warmth begin to spread outward from the fire. Across the room, others stir beneath quilts. A child rolls over and buries their face deeper into fabric. Breath rises in pale clouds that fade quickly as heat grows stronger. Researchers continue to explore how repetitive seasonal routines shape long-term resilience. Waking before dawn to revive flame day after day may have instilled habits of attentiveness that extended beyond winter itself. Historians still argue whether such routines fostered a cultural emphasis on thrift and discipline, often associated with 19th century frontier life. You cross to the window and wipe away a thin lace of frost. Outside, the landscape appears softer than before. Snow still covers the ground, but its surface glints faintly under a lighter sky. The air does not look as harsh. Perhaps the cold is easing slightly. There is an intriguing anecdote from certain prairie accounts describing how experienced settlers could sense subtle shifts in winter's intensity long before official calendars marked seasonal change. A slight difference in sunlight angle, the faint drip of melting snow from eaves. Small cues hinted that even the longest cold would not last forever. You return to the bed and fold back quilts, neatly shaking them once to release trapped moisture. Drying bedding near the fire during the day helped maintain insulation and comfort at night. Even routine tasks carried purpose. Another established observation from this era is that mornings often began with simple but hearty meals designed to fortify against cold. Porridge bread, perhaps salted meat, fuel for both body and fire. Sleep and sustenance worked in tandem to sustain endurance. You pause beside the hearth and extend your hands toward its strengthening warmth. The stiffness in your fingers begins to ease. Outside, a faint bird call reaches your ears, tentative but present. Even in winter, life persists. Scholars continue to debate how people in the 19th century perceived seasonal hardship. Did they frame winter primarily as adversity, or as an expected cycle woven into life's rhythm? Personal writing suggests both acceptance and frustration, yet rarely surprise. Winter was known. It returned reliably. You glance once more around the room. The walls stand firm, the roof holds, the floorboards no longer sting as sharply as when you first rose. The fire burns brighter, reclaiming its place as the centre of morning. There is a quiet pride in surviving another cold night. No grand celebration accompanies it, only the steady continuation of routine. Yet each dawn carries a small triumph. You step toward the door and feel a subtle difference in the air. It remains cold, yet something in it feels less severe. Perhaps the season is turning gradually. Perhaps you simply know how to meet it better now. In the coldest winters of 19th century America, endurance was measured not in dramatic victories, but in mornings like this. Embers alive, drafts sealed, bodies rested enough to rise again. And as you move into the new day, warmed by revived flame and the quiet confidence earned through repetition, you carry forward the knowledge that each night survived strengthens the one who meets it. As the century advances toward its later decades, you begin to notice small but meaningful shifts in the way winter nights are experienced. The cabin is still wooden, the quilts are still layered, yet new materials and ideas quietly weave themselves into the fabric of sleep. You sit at the edge of the bed and run your hand along the wall. Between the interior boards and the outer siding, there is now something more than empty space. In some homes built toward the end of the 19th century, builders began experimenting with rudimentary forms of insulation stuffing, sawdust newspaper, or even mineral wool into cavities to slow heat loss. It was not yet standardized, but the concept was emerging. It's a documented historical development that by the late 1800s, building practices in certain regions started to incorporate more deliberate insulation methods, particularly in the colder northern states. Advances in manufacturing and distribution allowed new materials to circulate more widely. Homes constructed in growing towns often benefited first from these improvements. You lie back and notice how the room retains warmth more consistently than older cabins you have imagined. Drafts still exist, but they feel less intrusive. The fire does not need as frequent attention to maintain a comfortable temperature through the night. There is a curious detail from late 19th century advertisements promoting felt paper and insulating boards as modern solutions to winter discomfort. These products were marketed as barriers against cold winds, promising healthier indoor environments. The language reflected a growing belief that domestic comfort could be engineered rather than merely endured. You tuck the quilt around your shoulders and reflect on how expectations may have shifted gradually. Families who once accepted visible frost on interior walls might now see it as a flaw to be corrected. Progress changes perception. What was once ordinary becomes undesirable once alternatives appear. Researchers continue to examine how these incremental technological improvements influence social attitudes toward winter. Historians still argue whether increased comfort fostered greater productivity during colder months, or simply raised standards that previous generations would have found extravagant. Outside, snow still covers the ground. Wind still brushes along the roof. Yet inside, the atmosphere feels more steel. The mattress beneath you might now be filled with manufactured batting rather than simple straw. Feather beds remain popular, but factory-produced textiles become increasingly accessible as rail networks expand. Another established shift of this era is the gradual spread of indoor plumbing in wealthier homes, though far from universal. In houses equipped with heated water systems or rudimentary radiators in the closing years of the century, winter sleep could occur in rooms warmed without visible flame. The concept would have seemed astonishing only decades earlier. You consider the psychological effect of such changes. When warmth becomes less precarious, sleep may deepen. Anxiety about dying embers or creeping drafts diminishes. Nights become less about vigilance and more about rest. There is a small yet delightful anecdote from some urban memoirs describing how children marvelled at the novelty of central heating systems that kept bedrooms warm without the need for individual stoves. They no longer had to rush from bed to fire in the morning. Comfort arrived quietly, almost invisibly. You close your eyes and sense how subtle these transitions are. The core principles remain. Shelter must still be maintained. Blankets still matter, yet the margin of safety widens slightly. Scholars continue to explore whether these advances were evenly distributed or concentrated among certain classes and regions. Rural communities often retained older methods well into the 20th century, relying on wood and coal long after newer technologies appeared in cities. Winter comfort evolved unevenly across the American landscape. You shift beneath the quilt and feel how evenly warmth surrounds you tonight. The need to tuck fabric obsessively against drafts feels less urgent. The walls seem to hold their own against the cold with greater confidence. Still outside the window, frost patterns form delicately along the glass. Winter remains present. It has not vanished. It has simply been moderated. Another firmly grounded historical observation is that by the end of the 19th century, architectural design increasingly considered climate more systematically. Builders paid closer attention to window placement, roof angles, and material selection to optimize heat retention. Knowledge accumulated across decades of trial and error began to formalize. You breathe in deeply, noticing the room's air feels less smoky than earlier eras you have imagined. Improved stoves and chimneys reduce soot and improve ventilation. Health and comfort intertwine gradually. As you drift towards sleep, you recognize that the coldest winters of 19th century America were met not only with endurance and improvisation, but with evolving ingenuity. Each decade layered new solutions upon old foundations. The quilts remain heavy. The fire still glows, yet behind walls and beneath floors unseen improvements whisper of change. And as you surrender once more to rest in this slightly more forgiving night, you sense that winter's edge, though still sharp, has been blunted by generations who refuse to accept discomfort as permanent fate. As winter stretches toward its final weeks, you begin to notice how memory gathers around the season. The nights you have imagined blur together into a pattern of embers, quilts, wind, and quiet perseverance. Yet in the 1800s, these experiences did not fade into abstraction. They were recorded carefully in ink on paper, preserved in letters and diaries that carried winter forward into future generations. You sit at a small wooden table near the hearth, a candle flickering gently beside you. Outside, snow still covers the ground, but its surface has softened slightly under lengthening daylight. The air no longer feels as severe as it did in mid-season. It is well documented that personal diaries were common among literate Americans in the 19th century, especially in rural and frontier settings, where isolation encouraged reflection. Many of these diaries include meticulous notes about weather temperature and the condition of firewood supplies. Winter nights often receive detailed mention. You dip a pen into ink and imagine writing about the previous evening. The embers held well. The wind quieted after midnight. The draught along the west wall required extra cloth. Such entries may seem mundane, yet they reveal the texture of daily life in cold climates. There is a compelling detail found in several frontier journals describing how families measured winter by counting the cords of wood remaining. Each entry might note how much fuel was consumed in a given week. The woodpile became a calendar of sorts, marking time in stacked logs rather than dates alone. You pause and glance toward the bed where quilts lie folded neatly. These textiles too carry memory. Patchwork squares might represent garments worn years earlier. Each winter they are unfolded again, linking present cold to past seasons. Researchers continue to examine how winter narratives shaped collective identity in different regions. In New England, harsh winters became part of regional character. In the Midwest, blizzards formed shared reference points across communities. Historians still argue whether these climatic experiences directly influenced broader cultural traits, such as thrift, self-reliance, and communal cooperation. You write a few more imagined lines. The children slept well. The stove performed steadily. Snow drifted high along the north fence. Even small observations carry weight when survival depends on them. Another firmly grounded historical fact is that letters sent across long distances often included detailed weather descriptions, allowing distant relatives to picture conditions vividly. A mother in Ohio might describe frost patterns on windows to a sister in Pennsylvania. Winter became a shared experience across miles through words alone. There is a charming anecdote preserved in some family archives where grandparents recounted particularly cold nights to grandchildren decades later, embellishing details of snow piled to rooftops and water freezing in basins. Memory softened hardship into story, transforming discomfort into narrative pride. You lean back in your chair and listen to the fire. It burns lower than earlier in the season, not because fuel is scarce, but because nights are gradually less brutal. The shift is subtle but perceptible. Scholars continue to discuss how recollections of winter hardship may have been romanticized over time. What felt exhausting in the moment might later be remembered as evidence of strength and resilience. Diaries capture immediacy, memoirs capture reflection. Both contribute to understanding. You close the journal in your imagination and extinguish the candle. The room dims once more, lit only by embers. Across the American landscape of the 19th century, countless households repeated similar gestures. Writing by lamplight, folding quilts, banking fires. Each winter added another layer to family memory. You slip beneath the blankets and feel their familiar weight. The mattress beneath you holds the impression of previous nights. The walls, though unchanged, seem less imposing now that you know how to meet them. Outside, snow glows faintly under starlight. The world remains cold, yet its severity has eased. The longest nights have passed. You think about how future generations will read those diary entries and letters, trying to imagine what it felt like to sleep through such winters without central heating or electric light. The words will carry only part of the sensation. The rest belongs to experience. Another established observation from historical archives is that many winter diaries conclude the season with a simple note of gratitude when thaw finally begins. Relief expressed not in grand language, but in quiet acknowledgement that endurance has borne fruit. You close your eyes and breathe slowly. The air feels gentler. The fire needs less tending. The quilt remains warm. As you drift towards sleep on this late winter night, you sense that the stories of cold embers and shared warmth will linger long after snow melts. They will become part of family lore, part of regional identity, part of a nation learning how to live with winter, rather than merely survive it. And within this small room, warmed by careful flame and layered memory, you rest peacefully knowing that even the harshest seasons leave behind tales of resilience that outlast the frost itself. You feel it before you can name it. The air has changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have startled you weeks ago, but enough that your breath no longer clouds quite as thickly in the early morning. The cold remains, yet its sharpest edge has softened. You lie beneath your familiar quilt and listen. The wind outside moves differently now, carrying a hint of moisture rather than brittle dryness. Snow still rests along the cabin walls, but somewhere beyond sight, melt has begun in subtle ways. Winter is loosening its grip. It's well established that by late winter in many parts of 19th century America, daytime thaw and nighttime freeze created the cycle of softening and refreezing snow. Roofs began to drip under afternoon sun, only to stiffen again by dawn. These gradual shifts signaled change long before landscapes turned visibly green. You rise quietly and approach the window. Frost patterns no longer spread thick across the glass. Instead, thin rivulets mark where ice has melted and run downward. The sight feels almost intimate, as if the house itself is exhaling after months of tension. You kneel by the hearth and stir the embers. They glow warmly, but you notice that the room no longer cools as quickly when the fire dips. Sunlight filters faintly through the window earlier each day, adding its own contribution to warmth. Researchers continue to explore how seasonal transitions affected morale in rural communities. Letters from late winter often carry cautious optimism. Supplies may be running low, yet hope rises with each lengthening day. Historians still debate whether relief at winter's end was felt more keenly in isolated homesteads than in urban centres, though diaries suggest that anticipation of spring was nearly universal. You step outside briefly and feel snow crunch less sharply underfoot. Along the eaves, small icicles drip slowly in the pale morning light. The sound is delicate and persistent, like a clock counting down winter's final hours. There is a charming detail found in some 19th century farm journals, noting the first time a hen laid an egg after deep winter as a sign that the season was turning. Small events carried symbolic weight. Life stirring again meant that cold would not dominate forever. You return inside and sit near the hearth, not because you desperately need its warmth, but because its presence feels familiar. The fire that guarded you through long dark nights now seems almost ceremonial. You have learned its language. You have measured your sleep by its steady glow. Another firmly grounded historical observation is that early spring often brought a different set of challenges. Mud replacing snow rivers, swelling with meltwater. Yet compared to the still isolation of deep winter, these changes felt dynamic and hopeful. You look toward the bed and remember nights when wind rattled walls and drafts demanded plugging. Nights when you listened for coughs and guarded embers carefully. Nights when quilts felt like armour against relentless cold. Scholars continue to examine how enduring such winters shaped collective identity in emerging American communities. Some argue that resilience in the face of harsh climate became woven into national mythology. Others caution against oversimplifying complex social realities into climatic narratives. The truth likely rests somewhere in between. You run your hand along the quilt's surface, feeling its textured seams. Each stitch has served its purpose, each layer has trapped warmth faithfully. Soon perhaps it will be folded away until autumn returns. There is a small but tender anecdote from certain family histories describing how children celebrated the first night they could sleep without wearing wool caps to bed. Such a minor change felt monumental after months of layered precaution. Comfort regained gradually. You add a final modest log to the fire and watch it catch. Flames rise gently, no longer battling severe cold, but simply sustaining morning warmth. The cabin feels lighter, as if it too senses the shift. You step back towards the window and notice a patch of dark earth emerging near the base of the wall where snow has thinned. It is small, almost inconsequential, yet it marks transformation. The coldest nights have passed. You survived them not through a single grand act, but through repetition. Banking coals, sealing cracks, sharing warmth, innovating when needed. listening to wind and trusting dawn. And now, as winter recedes quietly, you understand that sleep in 19th century America was never simply about closing your eyes. It was a nightly partnership between body shelter fire and season. You return to the bed one last time and sit on its edge, feeling the room's gentler air against your face. Outside, sunlight grows stronger. Inside, embers glow softly, no longer guardians against severe frost, but companions to a season ending. The long cold has taught patience. It has carved habits of care into daily routine. It has shown that warmth can be built, preserved and shared, even when the world beyond feels frozen and vast. You lie back beneath the quilt once more, not because you must defend against the night, but because rest now feels like reflection. The fire crackles softly. Snow drips beyond the window. Light stretches longer across the floor. Winter fades not with drama, but with a quiet surrender. And in that gentle easing, you close your eyes and breathe deeply, grateful for the steady resilience that carried you through the coldest nights. The cabin rests. The hearth glows low and content. Outside, thaw begins its patient work. You let the final warmth settle into your bones, knowing that seasons turn as they always have. The cold will return in time, but so will this knowledge. And as you drift into one last peaceful winter sleep wrapped in memory rather than necessity, the world beyond your walls softens into spring. Now the pace slows. The fire no longer demands your constant attention. The air inside the cabin feels balanced, neither sharp nor stifling. You notice how your breathing deepens, naturally unforced. The quilts that once shielded you from relentless frost now rest lightly against your skin. Outside, faint dripping continues from melting icicles, each drop a small promise. The snow's brilliance dulls slightly under growing sun, revealing hints of earth beneath. You allow your thoughts to stretch gently across the season you have just lived. The first biting nights, the careful banking of embers, the steady companionship of shared warmth, the quiet fear of fire's danger, the comfort of routine. Each memory settles softly, no longer urgent. The cabin feels larger now, less confining. Light lingers longer at the window. The hearth emits a calm, steady glow, not fierce, not desperate. You feel gratitude without drama. Gratitude for timber walls that held, for quilt stitched with patience, for flame coaxed faithfully from ash, for breath that remained steady through cold hours. Outside, a bird calls again, clearer this time. The sound carries through the thinning chill like a gentle invitation. You inhale slowly, then exhale, letting your body sink deeper into rest. There is no wind pressing at the walls tonight. No storm gathering beyond the ridge, only the quiet turning of seasons. The fire dims slightly, content to rest. The snow melts by degrees. The cabin stands patient and warm. You drift further into sleep, your mind light and untroubled, wrapped not in defense but in calm. And as winter loosens fully and spring waits just beyond the horizon, you settle into the softest quiet yet carried by warmth remembered and the steady rhythm of seasons that always return. Sweet dreams.